Okay, hello and welcome to a patch review, patch rundown. I'm not really sure what to call this, but uh, what's going to be me as a game designer that worked on season 14, going through the patch notes, every single thing in the patch notes, and talking about where the change came from, what we were thinking, that kind of stuff, what we're hoping to get out of the change, hopefully providing some interesting context and uh, hopefully just kind of an interesting video to listen to. I'm recording this before I actually record the video, so I have no idea how long it's going to be. I assume it's going to be really long. I mean, look at my scroll bar on the side there. These patch notes are absolutely massive, so this is going to take a while, and so I'll do some sort of introductions and get some stuff out of the way before I actually get into talking through the patch notes. So starting off with who am I and why am I doing this? If you don't know who I am, which most people don't, I'm Riot Endstep or Nick Fridge, Riot Nick Fridge. I've gone by a lot of different names. If you don't know me, I'm a game designer that works at Riot, specifically on the Summoner's Rift team's seasonal pod. What that means is basically that for the best, for most of 2023, I spent my every day working on this 1.14.1 patch, right? The changes that went in here. Specifically for me, I was working originally on items. I was given a task originally that was called figure out what to do with mythic items for this season, and the pitch that I made that obviously went through is that I pitched we remove mythic items from the game, and we then adjust item systems as necessary. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on with that. I can talk more about that if in another video if people want to hear about that process. But for the most part, what I'm talking about here is that I was initially the items guy, and so the things that I owned ended up being the demythicking of the system as a whole. Then the AP item system in particular, so the the new items there like Storm Surge, Malignance, as well as all the changes to things like Amp Tome, Large Rod, etc. The tank item system, and then Triple Tonic, the new rune that replaces Stopwatch. I also happen to have worked on Infernal Terrain quite a bit, but not the actual design part, just the uninteresting, unfun stuff like hooking up VFX and fixing bugs and stuff like that, because another designer basically worked on the initial design, locked that, and then passed it off to me when he went to work on another project. And so those are the things that I worked directly on in terms of like I did them like myself. I did the scripting, I did the actual design work. All those things are design not design work on Infernal Terrain specifically, but on most of those things I did the design work, or at least some of the design work. And so there are going to be things, just as a forewarning in this video, there are going to be things that I don't have full context on. Like, there were a lot of designers working on this season. Initially there were 3 of us. Over time, we added more designers. Towards the end, I think at its peak, we had, 9 different designers working on some part of the season. So a lot of different things going on, a lot of moving parts. And so there's going to be some things inevitably in this, long video that I'm going to get wrong. Some things that I maybe misunderstood another designer talking about, or maybe some assumption that I made that's incorrect, right? And even with my own stuff, it's possible that I misremember. Hey, something that happened 6 months ago, I might not remember perfectly, and so it's possible I get something wrong here. So just don't take everything in this video that I say as absolute, 100% must always be true. Also, if I say something that's confusing and it sounds like I have the wrong word, that probably happens. I do that a lot. Yesterday I was talking about ranged versus melee champions at the office, and I kept saying melee and I meant ranged, and people were confused. So that happens. If I say something wrong, sorry, it is what it is. If you're looking for more background on me specifically, some people know me as the Wild Rift guy who made a bunch of items in Wild Rift. That is true, but it's kind of funny that that's how people know me, because I worked on League for 4 years before I worked on Wild Rift, and I only worked on Wild Rift for a couple of years. So I've worked at Riot for a long time. But yeah, I'm back on League now and working on this season patch. So yeah, let's just get into it and start talking about that. So I'm going to start out by making a special thanks to Riot Ruru, who wrote the patch notes, who's excellent. It's a very hard job. I mean, look at how much stuff there is. Lots and lots and lots of stuff here. Lots of small things that can go wrong. Not every thing in the patch notes, had perfectly up-to-date internal documentation. And in fact, I think I'll actually mention there's a couple of things in the patch notes that either are incomplete or, very slightly, might have the, wrong number or something like that. And so I'll talk about that when we get to them. So starting out with the top Void Grub. So for those of you who haven't, listened to a lot of Void content, and I'm also just realizing that this is probably way too big. It's way too zoomed out for people to actually read. But starting with people that haven't seen this or haven't listened to a lot of like dev content around this, the Void grubs and mites came from a few different places. First of all, we were looking to experiment in a space that we hadn't done before with a horde objective, right? If you watched Flox's stream, he was showing off some clips of the cat cultist horde we were testing with at some point where he brought in a cat little legend from TFT and just like put 20 of them in the pit, and you fought a horde objective. So horde objective was something that we thought would be cool and interesting, and we tested the gameplay very early on, and we were like, oh yeah, the gameplay is actually pretty good, so let's try something there. And in general, this objective gameplay on the top side, we felt like left something, left a lot to be desired on the table. We had a lot of problems with the way that Rift Herald interacted with plates, like the fact that Rift Herald could blow up your laning phase a lot of the time when people used it to kill the last 2 plates, or could completely warp a matchup by donating 2 to 3 plates to someone who otherwise wouldn't have had a gold advantage. Generally, these things we weren't super happy with how Rift Herald interacted with pre-plate turrets, but we like Rift Herald as an objective, and so we thought it was worth keeping. And we'll get to talking about how that's changed in a bit. But the whole motivation to change the Void objective structure came from we weren't really happy with topside objective focus, and the results of the topside objective we did have before plates going down, we weren't really happy with. We weren't really happy with like, this person drops Herald in mid lane immediately after they get it just to farm 2 plates, and it's not really like an objective play. It's just an economic play purely, right? It's not really like a pressure or anything like that play. A lot of the time where you just drop the Herald, get 2 plates, move on, right? We weren't really super happy with how that had played out post tower plates. And before tower plates, we weren't really happy with the way that Rift Herald blew up laning phases by ending laning phases very easily, right? And so we've never really been happy with the Rift Herald super early, and so that's why it made a lot of sense for us to try and experiment with something new. And so that's kind of where we came up to this horde objective, so we ended up with the Void Grubs. Now there's only 3 of them now, but it's still pretty horde-like. I mean, if you play any jungler, and you actually try and take these things, they definitely feel very different than interacting with the dragon, where it's like you kill 3 of these things, you can only smite 1 of them. That's actually a really critical difference here, by the way, is that as a solo, like as a top laner, for example, you can actually exert more influence over these things because it's not possible for the jungler to smite all 3. Now, there are junglers that can secure all 3 pretty easily, like a Nunu, for example, that can, consume all 3, but that won't be the average case. And so there will be situations where if you're winning top really hard, but the enemy jungler is stronger than your jungler and just wants to do the grubs, then you might be able to stop that, right? Or you might be able to steal one or fight them or whatever, right? And so them not being completely smiteable, like not completely securable by smite, is actually a meaningful difference here between other objectives. And so it's part of this is to reward being in control of top lane and actually, having, theoretically to reward jungler investment into top lane too. Although, of course, we made terrain changes to make that a little bit less effective. That's a separate line of logic. Other notable things the other notable things that people might not be aware of is that the shield that the grubs get when another grub dies is based on their missing health. This is so that it's not just like trivial to AoE these things down, like if you're, some super great AoE jungler like an Amumu or something like that. It's so that, hey, when you kill one of them, the other 2 don't just also die instantly, because obviously, we tune junglers to be able to do both AoE and single target, right? We have the jungle ped, and we've given junglers a lot of AoE over the years, and so some of the AoE junglers have truly spectacular AoE, like outrageous amounts of AoE, and so the missing health shield is actually there to protect against some of the more egregious cases of, that's this thing here, the more egregious cases of AoE damage, and it does decay over 10 seconds, so if you're one of the slower junglers, even if you're an AoE jungler, you don't get too punished by this because it just decays if you're doing them slowly anyway. Um, as far as the actual reward for the buff, it's not the most exciting thing ever. It's true damage over time when you hit a structure. We tested a bunch of different versions of this. We just tested different versions of this that gave different outputs. But the goal of this is basically that it's a stacking buff that lets us have a clear reward for taking each grub, and then we can have an additional reward at the top number of stacks, right? Which is 5 and 6. You get the Void Mites when when you're in combat with a tower, by the way, which includes when you get hit by a tower as well as when you hit a tower. But you get the Void Mites if you have 5 or 6 stacks, and so the goal here is like, hey, kind of in a very miniature Dragon Soul way, we're rewarding you for full investment into this objective, right? And so we want the game to be interesting when one team invests into top side and the other team invests bot side. If you get both of the grub spawns, you should get a powerful buff that enables you to help take towers. And that actually also scales the number of Void Mites you get on Rift Herald. And so, if you continue vertical, like each, team is playing to one side, you both get these powerful buffs. But the Void objective buffs are less powerful and they come in earlier, right? You get the max stack Void Grub buff, and then you get the more powerful version of Rift Herald. But you get those earlier than like a Dragon Soul would come in, right? Even a very, very fast Dragon Soul can't come in before you get the first Rift Herald, or in this case, the Rift Herald, I guess I should say. So there's also some kind of moderately complicated rules around the taken per spawn group. We might need to fix those in the future or change those in the future. We'll see. Because I suspect this is probably a little confusing for most people. It's just the first one killed in each spawn group, which is maybe not the most intuitive, but we'll see how that works out. Here's their stats. They give some gold. Also for anyone who was listening to pro player stuff, we're talking about grubs. There was a bug on one of the Tournament Realm patches where the Void Grubs that you spawned because you had 5 or 6 stacks of the buffs accidentally gave like a ton of experience. They were never supposed to do that. That was just a bug with how they were classified. They were being classed as lane minions for some other reasons, and that attached experience to them they weren't supposed to have. So if you were looking at like pro player reviews of Void Grubs and they were telling you that, hey, the 5 and 6 stacks are bad because the enemy team gets a bunch of XP, don't worry about that. That's fixed. They don't give a bunch of XP anymore. Actually, I don't think they give any XP, although I'm not 100% sure. Again, this is something that was worked on by other designers, in this case, Captain Gameplay and Phlox, so I'm not entirely sure the exact state currently. So Rift Herald is another thing that we're looking to revamp here. Rift Herald is new and it does a lot of the same things that the old Rift Herald did. If you haven't seen this, basically what you do is you can hop into the Rift Herald. You can channel on it by right-clicking on the Herald if it's on your team once you've spawned it. The actual combat with the Rift Herald the first time is basically identical, although it obviously looks a little different, looks cooler. You can get into the Rift Herald and basically do like a Scion ult / like Nunu Snowball to charge into a turret. And what happens is you will get bounced out once the charge hits, and you can see it puts you at 75, 200 plus 75% of your attack range, so it puts you back far, and if you're a ranged champion, it'll put you back even further than that. So like if you use the charge on like Caitlyn, you won't be in melee range of the enemy structure, so it's not like trolling to use this even if you're ranged. There are obviously situations where it's bad, but it's not generically trolling. And you can see here the 5 plus the number of Hunger of the Void stacks of the user Void Mites are spawned. And so you get a shield, and if you have a bunch of stacks of the Void Mite buff, the Void Grub buff, you get a bunch of mites that help you take down turrets. So this is very, very similar in output to the old Rift Herald. And the way that we got here is actually really interesting. We were testing very large-scale changes to the Herald. One of the very first things we had in testing, which actually I believe, I wasn't around, I was working on Wilder for this time, but I believe it was in testing for a previous mid-season or seasons at some point. But we called it Mecha Herald, where we were testing this version of Rift Herald where you got into the Rift Herald, but instead of just casting one charge, it replaced all of your spells with Rift Herald spells. You had a swipe, you had a shield, you had the Rift Herald charge that dealt damage to turrets, and then your R would actually get you out of the Rift Herald and kill the Rift Herald or whatever. That kind of tested poorly. It was something where people were excited the first time. Like people generally had a lot of fun the first time or two that they used Rift Herald, and we actually have some really hilarious clips of people, getting into the Rift Herald, and then because we put a bunch of delays on the actual skills of the Rift Herald, because it's like supposed to be a slow lumbering Rift Herald, people being able to unable to actually kill someone because they were a Rift Herald, and their spells had a lot of gameplay. Even the the long cast time swipe the Rift Herald has, that kind of thing. People thought it was usually pretty funny the first couple, first one or two times they got in the Rift Herald, but it once you played a few games of it, most people found it to be really a frustrating experience to interact with. And this kind of gets back to one of the core things that I'll talk about later with items, which is that League of Legends really is about playing your champion, and so having a Rift Herald that replaced your champion, especially the version that we were testing, was it could potentially replace your champion for a long time, like 45 plus seconds, and so you weren't playing your champ, right? You might pick Hecarim and then play Rift Herald for like a minute in the middle of the game in a way that was kind of unsatisfying for most players. And so that was one of the things that we just kind of looked at and we said, okay, this is kind of cool once. Is there something about this that we can preserve that's actually cool and fun? And the charge version, where it's just you get into it and you charge at a tower, is fun and also provides new, real, actual, real, meaningful gameplay for the Herald, where there are situations where, because the charge is actually fairly fast, you actually can do rotations with this thing, right? You can drop this thing in the river and then go charge down to the bot turret or whatever, and actually make a rotation with the Rift Herald in ways that you couldn't have before, right? Another thing that's cool about the charge is that it actually makes there's a compelling reason to use the charge at long range, whereas previously you could drop Rift Herald wherever you wanted, but dropping it anywhere other than right outside a turret was just trolling, because they gave your opponents more time to counterplay the Herald, right? Whereas the new version, which has a charge on it, there's actually good reasons to use it at longer range. You can still use it at low range if you want. It's still just as effective at charging the turret, but there's actually a reason why you would want to use it at long range, which is to get value out of the higher movement speed of the charge relative to just walking around. And so if you're a jungler and your bot lane is winning the 2v2 and they kill, maybe they get a kill in the 2v2 and you're like, oh, I really want to rip their tower so that we can take that down or whatever, you can just drop the rift in the river, hop in it yourself, and then go drive it to the bot lane or whatever, right? Which is a pretty common play. That type of play is pretty common. When one of your laners gets an advantage, you just kind of drive it in, and you can get value out of that, which is pretty cool. So personally, I really like this what's it called? This whole setup where the Rift Herald is kind of a temporary vehicle. But it's not something that you get into and transform into, because that version, as I mentioned, it just didn't test that well. People just generally didn't really want to stay the Herald for a long period of time, and having your abilities replaced for a long period of time generally just wasn't that fun of an experience. So here are the Void buffs. Talking about the Void buffs, this is the Void Empowered blue buff here. Basically, the difference here is what we've done is we've nerfed the top-end scaling of blue buff and red buff. Blue buff is now just flat 10 haste instead of scaling up to 20. And the top-end scaling of the red buff regen is down. And instead of having the buff sharing system where two people on your team can get a buff, everyone can get the buff after 20 minutes, basically. Is if you take a buff, your whole team gets it. This was intended, really, this is something we've been experimenting with more than once. More than one, season in the past has actually experimented with not necessarily global buffs, but how do we make the buffs into interesting, powerful objectives, right? Actually, I don't remember what season this was, but in the past we had a version of blue buff that gave you percent AP that actually was a real meaningful objective later in the game. And that didn't do that in a way that we liked, so we removed it. But in general, we've always wanted there to be a reason to fight over, or a good compelling reason to play around things besides the epic objectives in the late game. And so the buffs are a good place to do this, and so having them apply to your whole team is obviously really nice, right? 10 haste and infinite mana, or essentially infinite mana on your whole team, is a lot more compelling. Same thing with red buff, the out of combat regen and the slow on auto attacks for your whole team is a lot more exciting, especially because unlike the buff sharing system that's on live, the 2-person buff sharing, the person who's getting the buff doesn't need to be there, right? And so I've had situations playing on this, this seasonal patch, months ago, where if I'm playing an assassin or someone who's just pretty mobile later in the game, not too much is going on, getting in and stealing an enemy buff, right? Like if I like hop over the Baron pit and get into the enemy's red jungle or whatever, and I steal their red, that's actually a really big deal because now we all have red buff and they have no red buffs, right? And so those like having like sort of mini objectives was sort of the goal here, and it's also just a really nice feels good thing where people can't really steal buffs from you because if they're on your team and they get it, your whole team gets it, right? And so it reduces a lot of the friction that we see around late game buffs around like hey, someone feeling like they should get the buff or whatever. It's kind of just an extended version of the buff sharing thing that we already did with even less friction and kind of a much nicer set of rules that make the buffs also more worth contesting and thinking about in the later parts of the game. And one other thing to note here is that the Voidborn buffs don't transfer on death, right? So when you get a global blue buff, it's not like then there's just blue buff on everyone for the rest of the game if there's a lot of fighting. It's just once you get the global blue buff or red buff, if you die, that's it. It's over, right? There's no transferring. Yeah. And I think that's it for the buffs. The Scuttle Crab is an interesting one. This is one that Phlox was experimenting with a little bit. There were a few different versions of this that we tested, but ultimately the like kind of voided out crab is sort of a like kind of like the Chemtech Scryer's Blooms, where it gives you a big, very, very big vision area that pings all the wards, drops them to 1 HP, makes them very easy to kill. We tried a bunch of different versions of this. This version is just a gigantic circle, basically, where you kill the crab, it just illuminates a whole circle. Again, this is more on the point of like, hey, we wanted people to have something on the map besides the epic objectives that's worth fighting over. And so particularly when an epic is coming up, right, whether this is like a dragon or a baron or whatever, the Void Scuttle Crab is actually like really powerful, right? Like if the dragon's coming up in 40 seconds and you kill this crab, where the enemy vision in the area is and you can very easily clear it out, right? And so this can give you a lot of control, and it, again, is just like an objective that's worth fighting over. That's not like something that you want to... It's not something that's going to win or lose the game by itself, but it might lead to something that would win or lose the game. And so it's an objective that's worth thinking about and fighting over, but it's not quite on the level of like a dragon or a baron or whatever, right? These kind of mini objectives are things that have tested really, really well. And I think they actually work really well, particularly the Void Crab. I really like how it's a really compelling reason it's a much more clearly defined reason to get to an objective ahead of time and secure this thing, right? Like if your Baron's coming up in a minute and you go and you get the Void Crab, it's like, oh, okay, I understand that they had a ward in the pit that would have seen us if we started the Baron on spawn, but now we know that they can't, like they have to come back out here and we can set up a pick or a trap or whatever. So I really like the way that the Void Crab has worked out with how it just explodes in a big area and gives you tons and tons of vision. Yeah, I actually really quite like the Void Crab, which, again, is not my work. And then the kind of final update to the Void vertical, the topside objectives, is Baron. There are some Baron variants which have different pits. So you'll see one of 3 different pits. There's kind of like the standard pit, then there's the tube pit, and then there's kind of like the mountain pit. I don't really want to get into explaining all of these, partially because I didn't do this work, so... I don't necessarily want to, try and conjecture and explain like, hey, we did this bit because of that or whatever, right? But they're mostly just intended to give some kind of minor variance on the Baron fights. Like, yeah, there should be some situations where, you were playing a champion and the Baron fight is a little bit different because of the pit, but it's not going to be like the Baron fight is completely different and it's like a whole different objective, right? The buff is always the same, and the actual fight with Baron itself is mostly the same, right? It does have one different spell per pit, but the spells don't end up being super meaningful. They can, again, they cause minor, like some very minor variance on the fights, but it's really more intended to be Baron fight, the Baron combat, the Baron fight, and the, like, especially contesting around Baron is shaken up a little bit because there's a different Baron spell, or because the pit is different. It's a slightly different, bit of variance per game. Like, game to game, you might have one fight that plays out differently because you're in the tube pit, and one fight that plays out different because you're in the standard pit or whatever. But it's not intended to be like absolutely game-breaking, game-shatteringly different experience. Which, you know, some things, you know, the reason why we did that is because we think Baron was already a good experience. Like that, the Baron was, you know, Baron fight was doing a lot of the things that we wanted it to do, and it was generally like a solid part of the game. But that it could use maybe a little more variance, a little bit more change from game to game, right? Like a little bit more difference and more reasons to think about the way that you play around the Baron, right? Because one of the things to think about is like Baron had his visuals updated in 2014 with the map update, but his gameplay really hasn't changed since the beginning of the game, right? And so there are people out there who have been doing the exact same Baron fight for over 10 years. And so, you know, if you average one game of League a day, you probably average one Baron, you know, one or more Baron fight per game. You know, you're talking about people who have fought the same Baron fight many thousands of times, right? And that's not even considering people who play way more than that, right? And so injecting a little bit of variance here is mostly just hey, this thing is good, but it could be a little like, but there are other ways in which it can be good, and it could be a little different than what it is now. And so just like, hey, it's a little bit different. It's still going to be good. It's still going to be the same core encounter, but it'll be a little bit different. And again, keep in mind that what's it called? The buff is still the same, right? You still get the Hand of Baron buff. It still buffs your minions, right? We still have all the same goals for Baron, you know, ending the game and being able to enable you to push into bases and all of that. Yeah, nothing too different there. And here are the different examples of pits. So here's like the standard pit, which is the Hunting Baron pit. This is what we were calling internally the mountain pit, because it has the like little like mountain rock in the front, and then there's two wider entrances on the side. And you can see this is a Shaco, by the way, because this Phlox made these images, and so of course he was just putting a Shaco in there for fun. And then this is what we were calling the tube pit, the longer pit that has entrances on the side. This one I'm actually really interested to see how it plays out, because in our tests it actually, I think, is less, maybe it provides less different gameplay than you might think. But yeah, it's something I'm very interested to see how this plays out, especially in like pro play and things like that, because I think there's actually some interesting avenues of flanks and things like that that are provided by the tube. But yeah, we'll see how this plays out. So there's some flanking angles there. So let's talk about the terrain. Again, this is a project that was mostly done by Phlox and Captain Gameplay. You know, different parts of them. They both worked on different parts of this. But you can see here immediately, there's a new big rock on topside. At this point, I'm sure most people watching this video, if you're watching this video, you're probably pretty invested, so you've probably already seen this, but there was a specific goal with the new rock, which was, hey, we know that there's very meaningful differences in how people play top and bot, like the side lanes, based on which side they are, that have nothing to do with champion select, right? For example, in pro play, you know, even though red side has counterpick, it's generally a lot safer to play a carry on blue side in top lane, because this rock here on the you can see here on the left actually protects you from ganks. It's you know, in the previous version of the map right here, if I'm circling this like right rock, the enemy jungler used to be at very low investment used to be able to walk behind you, and it was much less safe on red side, because if you're like, let's suppose, look at the halfway up the lane point, it's very difficult in the new version of this Rift, if you're halfway up the lane, for a jungler to get behind you, right? Obviously making exceptions for certain junglers like Zac, Kayn, etc. But normal junglers, it's very hard for them to actually get like directly behind you, or have an easy time, you know, kind of collapsing on you from a superior, you know, angle of attack, right? Whereas before we added this rock, if you were red side, even directly in the center of the lane, it was very easy for any jungler to just come up behind you and just murder you indiscriminately in a pretty low investment play. And so basically what we've done here by opening up the mouth here of top lane and making this extra rock is, in general, made it a little bit harder to gank top lane slightly, because the top laner will always see you coming, you know, from their vision range here. and secondarily made the middle, like made this area, this like pixel brush here in the mouth of top lane river, a very valuable point to control for the top laners, right? And so what this means is that if you're the winning top laner, you get to control this bush with a pink ward if you want, right? Obviously, if you're winning, it'd be very hard for your opponent to contest anything in this pixel, right? And so the goal here was to both equalize out the sides, overall make top lane slightly harder to yank, and also reward the winning top laner more. Because previously, because this brush was against the wall, and then there was tri-brush that you had to cover, before, with 2 places to control, even if you were the winning top laner, it was very unrealistic to actually control both points of interest in the top lane sort of river entrance. Whereas now, since there's sort of one primary point of interest, it's a lot more realistic to actually control that as a winning top laner, whether that's with a regular ward or whether it's with a pink or whatever. It doesn't really matter how you're controlling it. It's a lot easier to control it. It's more realistic to ask top laners to control that to avoid being ganked. Even if they're pushing up pretty far, because just having this pixel warded gives you a lot of warning before you actually can be ganked by most junglers. Again, obviously there are going to be some junglers that are better at this than others, right? Like Zac, for example, can like gank you over this wall or over this wall. Same with the thing with like Rek'Sai and Kayn. But that'll be just a unique strength of those small handful of champions that can do that. That will still be good at ganking top lane, but you'll still be able to see them coming from further away than you could before in the olden days, most of the time, right? Obviously, this specific pathway for like Rek'Sai is not different, but the pathway on red side is a little different. It's actually slightly worse than live, although it's obviously relative to other junglers much improved, right? Because other junglers can't gank through this pathway at all, whereas Rek'Sai still can, right? Same thing with like Kayn, etc. That sort of hopefully covers the top lane stuff, where top lane we wanted to kind of accomplish multiple different goals at the same time, right? Equalize red and blue side gankability to something that would be similar, or much closer than it was. Make it so top lane in general was a little harder to gank. Make it so that winning top lane rewarded you with more control of the lane by pushing a brush into the center of the lane. That's very rewarding to control. These are kind of the things that we were all looking to get at, and I'm very happy with what we ended up with. And by we, I mean I didn't work on this, so not me specifically, but sort of we in the sort of more royal sense, I guess. Let's move on to mid. Mid changes are a little more interesting in some ways, a little bit less in some. The big like, kind of immediate thing we did, one of the very first things we tested was just pushing the brush back. This has some changes, has some meaningful. Oh, actually, top lane terrain. By the way, this is something I'll just mention offhand. There are going to be some champions that probably need to be changed because this area is so open now. So like Camille and Poppy, for example, their like laning gameplay is a little different now. Like Camille, for example, was already true that you generally didn't actually want to E in a lot of matchups. You generally wanted to trade with Q and W, but like now you really can't trade with E very much because there's not very many walls. So there are going to be some champions that might need some changes because of these terrain changes, and we'll be watching the ones that we think are most likely to be outliers. So just keep that in mind. Hey, if you're watching this video and thinking Camille sucks now, it's like that might be true. If that's true, then we'll make adjustments as necessary. But yeah. Anyway, talking about mid specifically, mid lane we pushed out these brush, and this is something that we've talked about doing for a long time, right? Like this is something that I remember people talking about 4 years ago, 5 years ago even, was pushing out these mid lane brush. And the primary reason to push out the mid lane brush is to give mid laners a little more warning and make it more viable to play immobile carries in mid lane. So this is some champions like Xerath and Brand that were primarily mid laners in the past, but have mostly migrated to the support role. And this isn't the only it's not the only reason that they moved out of mid was that they were getting ganked too much and dying, but that didn't help, right? And so one of the things that we're looking to do here is kind of improve the viability of immobile mid laners who aren't very good at escaping ganks by giving them a little bit more room to work with. Now, there are other changes here. One of the interesting things you might note is that there's sort of a pathway out of the turret, or into the turret, depending upon how you're looking at it. And that actually comes with these big rocks. And this is something that I haven't really seen people talking about. I've seen pros playing around this a little bit. But what this big rock does is it means that there's not actually a side passage that the jungler can approach them from here. And so let's suppose you're a blue side mid laner, right? You're blue side laner, you're Ari or whatever, right? If you have control, like vision control over anything in this area, right? That could include this brush, or the kind of ramp, the ramp into the enemy jungle here. You can actually be very, very safe playing on the top side of the lane here because the jungler can't just like walk through your. He's generally not going to be able to walk through your turret, right? And very few junglers can like jump over this wall or anything. Again, there are a handful that can, your Kanes and your Zacks and stuff like that. But under most circumstances, this gives you a kind of strong side of the lane to play to, where blue side gets to play to the strong top side and red side gets to play to the strong bot side, right? Because if you play to the opposite side, there's more danger of a jungler or support or whatever approaching you through this ramp, which is another potential avenue that you might need to have vision control over, right? It's like, sure, if you're the blue side top laner, you can ward here and have control over this ramp, but then that kind of precludes you from having full vision control over this brush, right? It's like, sure, maybe you have a regular ward here and like a pink in the brush or whatever, right? But imagine instead you just have a regular ward here on this side. That sort of protects you from the approach here into this brush, and that generally gives you, almost full information that you can't really be ganked on this side. And so, the goal here was make immobile mid laners more viable, and also make it so that junglers have a like not necessarily a like impossible time ganking mid, but so that it is a little bit more difficult for junglers to gank mid. Not that it is impossible to succeed, but that the avenues are a little bit more limited, and you need to work for more, potentially more vision control or look for better timings so that you can actually kill mid laners. Now, of course, there are champions that can completely disregard this, right? Nocturne at level 6 doesn't care about any of this stuff, right? Vi at level 6 also doesn't care about a lot of this stuff. And so some of the old champions that are already really good at ganking mid are still going to be good at ganking mid, because they have the ability to access mid laners without, tons and tons of gameplay. But again, a lot of this is just trying to deal with the average case of getting ganked by Lee Sin from, the random mid lane brush or whatever. The goal was to improve that experience for champions like Brand and Xerath especially. Now, this does mean that some of the immobile, less mobile champions that already existed in mid that were good, like Orianna, Syndra, etc., might be, too good at being ungankable in this new world. And so we might need to change them, right? It's possible that Syndra should have 5 less MS or something like that because she's now actually even safer than she was before. Again, a lot of these things we have our predictions of what's going to happen when we make these changes, but it's very, very, very hard to be 100% confident. And so a lot of the things we're just looking and saying, hey, we're going to see how this manifests for different, different champions, and then we'll follow up as necessary if we need to make champion adjustments. Also, one of the cool things here is that these little side paths basically guarantee that you have a safe, a relatively safe kind of roaming opportunity, which again is kind of side-based, which is an interesting way of doing side-based stuff, which we previously it was just, hey, red side top lane is more vulnerable and blue side bot lane was more vulnerable to ganks. Now it's mid laners have an easier time accessing, blue side has an easier time, mid lane has an easier time accessing top side and is safer on top side, and red side mid lane is an easier time accessing bot lane and is safer on bot side, which I think is a much better way personally of doing side differences in the map, where the mid laner can exert their influence more easily here, but it's not just anyone going to top lane has an easy time killing them if they have if the top laner is on red side, right? So I personally really like that difference there. So let's talk about bot lane. A lot of the stuff I've already said kind of covers bot lane. It's mostly a reflection of top, where previously, blue side bot lane was just more vulnerable, and now red side is equally vulnerable. Another thing we've also done here is kind of similar to top lane. We've made it more valuable to control kind of the center of the lane, and so winning bot lane has a more meaningful impact on the entrance to bot river. There are a lot of differences here, and I personally have a suspicion that red side bot lane might be a little bit too vulnerable, but we'll see how that plays out. There are things that we can adjust to make it so that red side bot lane is a little bit less, party time, where people just run through here to kill bot lane or whatever. You have to keep in mind, it's not perfectly mirrored, obviously, right? Because there are differences in the terrain because, there's a dragon pit here, right? We have to deal with the dragon pit being there. And so we can't perfectly mirror everything in this case. And so there are some differences. I don't have as strong opinions about the bot lane terrain as I do about the mid and top terrain, and I also just haven't played much bot lane on the 14.1 patch, because when I play in our internal playtests, I mostly am playing like jungle, mid, or top, because those are just the roles that I play mostly, I guess. And also we have a lot of people who play bot and support, so I just don't play those roles as much, so I don't have as strong of an opinion or understanding of what's going on here. But yeah, it's a lot of similar goals to the top lane stuff, to be clear. Like equalizing the sides out to some degree, making it so that red side bot lane is not just like crazy safe, which was previously the case, right? Like it's very, very hard to do anything to red side bot lane except dive them, right? And that's why when you saw pro play, like there are actually situations where in pro play you would see cases where blue side teams wouldn't get dove because it was hard, like slightly harder to dive them but easier to gank them, and then red side teams would or would not get dove based on, hey, can we actually get the push, right? And so like pushing bot lanes were actually very powerful on red side, because if you could get the push, it was very hard to dive you, right? And so because they were less vulnerable to ganks, the pushing bot lanes on red side were much more powerful. And so this will actually overall lightly reduce the power of like pushing bot lane in pro, because both sides are relatively close to equally vulnerable to getting ganked when pushed up. So layered on top of this, there are some changes to the jungle, which are mostly kind of fallout from the lane changes themselves, but there are also some just kind of changes for the jungle itself, like opening up this pathway here, and there's just a little bit of geometry difference in the jungle, not anything too crazy. Okay, so let's get to the Infernal Terrain. This is actually the first thing in the patch notes that I myself directly worked on. Again, context for this is that another designer who was working on another project got pulled in to do the Infernal Terrain design. He did the initial design, locked the kind of direction of, hey, there's going to be cinders that spawn on the map that you collect, and they give you some power, there's some buff, and then when you die, you lose some of them or whatever. And then pass that off to me to go back to working on his other project. So this is a kind of an experimental thing. We're trying out, we've obviously done a lot of experimentation and research on the elemental terrains over time, right? We tried the original Chemtech dragon, which really didn't work out. We have the new Chemtech. We have Hextech, which people like. And we actually did a lot of surveying and research on which dragons do people like. Now, as you might expect, what we pretty quickly found was, yeah, people really like Chemtech and Hextech Rift, which have obviously a lot more real gameplay to them than the base 4 original Rifts. And so these Infernal Terrain changes are an experiment in the space of what happens if we try a new, like, kind of layered gameplay mechanic on an old Rift. Is this fun? Is this specific type of mechanic fun? Like, do we need to come up with something that's kind of entirely novel, like Hextech Rift's gates every single time? Or is kind of a relatively simpler mechanic that has sort of a minigame feel to it, is that good for a map state? Like, is that good for a piece of terrain? You'll note that Infernal Terrain no longer destroys any walls on the Rift. Part of this is just because we had to redo the map to, do all of the new terrain and stuff, and we didn't feel like the terrain removal was really very compelling. Like, when we did surveys, Infernal actually rated as, I believe, I don't remember whether it was the bottom or I think it was number 2 from the bottom. I don't recall exactly, but it rated very low on players' estimation of like, hey, is this interesting? Is this cool? Is this fun? Mountain, I believe, is the other. They were very close on the bottom of like, these aren't interesting. People actually felt like Cloud and Ocean are more compelling, more interesting, but not as good as like if we were stack ranking them for the average player, we know that at the top are kind of Hextech plus Chemtech, and then in the middle are Cloud, Ocean, and then at the bottom, Infernal, Mountain. And so we decided to try something new for Infernal because their wall destroying, didn't really seem compelling, where we have this minigame mechanic. And so we have this mechanic, which is kind of like miniature haste Medjai's, but mixed with like Bard passive, where you can walk around the map and pick stuff up. It's a weird kind of eclectic mix of mechanics, and again, like I said, it does have a bit of a minigamey feel to it, but I suspect that people will enjoy picking up the cinders. And the reality is, like, a lot of people have this like fear of like, oh, people are gonna have crazy amounts of haste. The truth is that we don't drop that many cinders per second. Like I don't remember uh, the exact numbers, but I think it spawns a group of cinders, which can be 2 or 3 cinders. I believe every 15 seconds, every 14 seconds, something like that. I don't remember the exact numbers because it's been a while since I've looked at this, even though I'm the one that set the numbers. So sorry. But even if you were theoretically, and this is not possible, right? But like even if you were theoretically to get every single cinder as soon as it spawns, it's not. It like ultimately doesn't end up as a crazy, ridiculous amount of haste, right? Getting to 100 haste, or sorry, getting to 30 haste would mean you would need 100 cinders, which in testing we never saw anyone get that high, right? Not on these numbers, right? There was a version where I spawned the cinders a lot more frequently, and you dropped more when you died, where you could get that many cinders, and that was like obviously we moved away from that for a lot of good reasons. But yeah, the amount of haste you're going to get from this typically is just not going to be that high, right? Like if you're getting somewhere in the realm of like 5 to 10 haste, that is in my experience the typical amount. Now, granted, playtests are not the same as live, right? And so we'll get a lot of information very quickly on live if our numbers are off. And the expectation here is that this amount of haste that you're getting from the Infernal Cinders is not going to be super high, right? Like we don't want people to be getting 30 plus haste from this mechanic, both because we think that that amount of haste is very warping. We'll talk about that. I'll talk about that in the items section. We think that like high amounts of haste are very warping to champions, and we don't really want to support that. And also because we don't want this mechanic to take over the game, right? We don't want this mechanic to feel like it's telling you must kill everyone on the enemy team in order to succeed, right? Like we just want this to mostly be a little bit of extra context on how you path around the map. And the haste is a very generic stat we can give champions that works for basically everyone. We did have a version of this, by the way, that gave different stats based on like what your items were, but it was very complicated. And so I replaced it with haste because it's a very generic stat. It's obviously a more dangerous stat, but we can just give it in small amounts. And so the goal here is, hey, this is kind of a fun additional mechanic that rewards you for pathing a little bit differently around the map than you normally would to pick up cinders. And you probably won't notice the amount of haste you're getting, but it'll do something for you and it'll make you slightly more powerful. And in the very extreme cases, when you do get 70 cinders because you stayed alive for 10 minutes and picked up a bunch of cinders and picked up a bunch of the cinders off of someone else, other people's bodies and stuff like that, because you do lose it. You drop a percentage of them on death around you, although there's also an entropy rate where when you die, some of them get destroyed. So I made sure that this is not just like an escalating mechanic where you get infinitely more and more over time. They do actually get destroyed when you die, or some percentage of them get destroyed when you die. Anyway, it's mostly just intended to be more of like a minor interest type of mechanic, not we're going to funnel all of the cinders into our Syndra because then she'll have 600 haste and win the game instantly, right? That's not really what we're going for here. And if that's optimal, then we can just change the mechanic, nerf it, or change the mechanic to do something else a little, to fix that up. Hui, this is the only champion change in here because this is, having to do with a new champion. If you want to hear about this, Freak, you can go look up Freak's YouTube channel. He talks about this in his most recent video. I believe it's called like 14.1 preview or something like that. So if you want to hear more about the Hui changes, this is actually a kind of interesting time. I don't know if this is a good thing for this video, but actually kind of an interesting thing that I think a lot of people don't know is that so the Summoner's Rift team, which is the team that manages like League of Legends live gameplay, is split into 2 primary pods. These are the seasonal pod and the live pod. Freak is on the live pod, and this Hui change is the only change, I believe, from the... Actually, no, I think... No, this change is also from Freak, so never mind, I take that back. So these 2 changes, I think, are the only changes from the live pod in this patch. Everything else is the seasonal pod. And that's because the live pod focuses on the kind of short to medium term, which is like, hey, this patch, maybe a couple patches out. And of course, they do think about, hey, in 6 months, is this change going to be good? But the bulk of their focus is on how can we make the game... Like, how can we make a patch that makes the game, the most improvement to the game possible, right, in the short term. Whereas the seasonal pod, which is the pod that I work on and pod that like Flox works on, is more about the long term of how can we make League of Legends better in a year, right? That's why I and Flox and several other designers spent the better part of 2023 working on this 14.1 patch. So that's sort of extra context for anyone who's like looking at the way that like Freak's patch previews and things like that. If you're thinking about or asking about the way that he thinks about the game and things like that, it's like his position is mostly focused on what can he do right now, not necessarily like what could he do if he had an entire year to work on a change or whatever, right? And so like keep that in mind if you really like watching Freak's videos, is like like the place that he's coming from is from the live pod, which is not necessarily looking at things in a way that is, hey, I have a year to work on this. He's looking on this more of like, well, if I had 2 patches, I could do this, like, I could get this much value out of it. And so that's, it's more about an evaluation of what's the amount of value I can get in a short or medium amount of time rather than a long period of time, if that makes sense. Sorry, I'm talking a lot, so got to drink a lot of water. As people who watch my streams will remember, got the water bottle here. So, Hui and the jungle damage adjustments. I'm just not going to really talk about these because if you want to hear more about the context behind these, you can go watch Freak's videos. So, I'm not going to talk about that. Items. Okay. This is the big thing that I started working on when I came back to League from Wild Rift, which was in April of 2023. So this is what I immediately started working on. Now, if you want some extra context, you can go to these links, just go to the 14.1 patch notes and check these out. I think this is Froxon's article, and then this one is my article that I wrote with Rose T. But the overarching goals here are basically, number one, to reduce the power of the item system, right? One of the things that we've consistently felt since we introduced Mythics to the game was not necessarily that Mythic items were OP. That doesn't really mean anything. This is one of the things that, like, if you're talking to devs, don't tell them something is like, some part of a system is OP, because it doesn't really make sense. It's like, systems can't really be OP. It's just systems can have the wrong amount of power, which you could call being OP, but doesn't really make sense. It's not really the same kind of argument that you're making. The reason why we believe Mythic items require too much power, there's sort of like a line of logic here. It's like, okay, so Mythic items have to be really compelling and interesting. They have to be deep, and they have to actually offer real choice, right? These are all the like original goals of Mythic items, right? And to offer real choice and to actually be compelling items, we need them to be really powerful to fill that, right? An item like, for example, Everfrost can be a really compelling choice in a Mythic structure, but it requires a ton of power in order to be able to do that, right? A low power version of Everfrost doesn't really make sense, right? That's like GLP, which isn't a very compelling item by itself, right? And so because of this paradigm, we get into this point where the Mythics require a lot of power in order to be compelling and in order to fulfill the goals that they originally had, that we set when we made Mythic items, right? And we believe that League of Legends is a worse game when the item system has the amount of power that's required to make the Mythic system work. And the reason for that is because when the item system has lots of power, League starts to be less driven by champions and more driven by items as a system, and more systemically driven, right? We saw a similar paradigm shift, by the way, when we made Runes Reforged, which of course put more power in the rune system, right? And we felt, and I'm making this argument as like the way that I made this argument when I pitched that we should remove Mythics from the game, to be clear. Not everyone agrees, right? I'm not saying that literally everyone at Riot Design agrees with me, because not everyone does, but different people have their own reasons to agree, or disagree with Mythics being removed, and generally design leadership was aligned with me, and my argument was compelling enough that we did remove them. And I guess I got kind of sidetracked there. But yeah, so let's go back to the chain of logic here. Mythics require a lot of power to meet their goals and to be compelling, right? And they do some positive things, right? One of the positives that we got out of Mythics, for example, was that this actually made the item system more learnable for newer players, because they could concentrate on a smaller group of items to learn of, like, hey, if you're learning AD Assassins, you only really need to know about Gore Drinker, Eclipse, and Dustblade, right? Or that's the original version, right? Or in the original, and Prowler's Claw, I guess, in the original AD Assassin system. And then, of course, we changed the items or whatever. But you see the point here, right? It's like we can concentrate people who are learning the system on a smaller number of these items, right? And so the learnings can be concentrated in a way that's very healthy for newer players. But we also created the rec item system, which actually kind of helps the new players learn as well. Like, we can just surface a bunch of interesting choices to them, and that helps them learn too. And so we didn't really feel like we needed mythic items to do that, or to perform that function anymore, right? And so while mythics did have some positives, there were some upsides. We generally believe that the downsides, which were that They needed to be really powerful, which meant that the item system needed to be really powerful, which meant that champion kits ended up being less relevant, right? And that's something that we're really unhappy with. Like, League as a game is very fundamentally driven by the champion experiences, right? We create these tailored experiences. This is one of the things that separated, in the early days of League of Legends even, separated League from a lot of the other MOBAs, where MOBAs like Han and Dota would, they presented you with very system-driven experiences, right? You could buy a spell, like a literal spell on an item that was often more powerful than any of your spells, and you would have that same experience on no matter what hero you picked in Han or in Dota or whatever, right? And League didn't offer those experiences, right? What League did was say, hey, the item system is here to enhance the champion experience, but when you play Ezreal, you're playing Ezreal, right? You're not playing an item. When you play Jarvan, you're just having a Jarvan experience. And maybe you might build full AD Jarvan and you have a really different Jarvan experience than the guy who's building full tank, but you're still having a Jarvan experience, and it's a very tailored experience built around a kit, right? Now, this isn't to say that this is better or worse, right? I just, truly, I think it's just different. But part of the problem with the Mythic item system was that this warped this, right? A lot of this ended up being, Divine Sunder is a really good example of this, of, hey, I pick Camille and then I feel like I'm playing Divine Sunderer, right? Like the experience that you got playing like Camille or Jax or Wukong versus a tank when you bought Divine Sunderer was very similar. You just take these short trades with them and you can't really lose. You just play the Divine Sunderer pattern, right? You actually warp your pattern, like the way that your champion plays, around this item that you purchased, right? And some, like, to be clear, some amount of this is actually totally acceptable in League. It's just that we crossed a line, pretty clearly when we did Mythics, where it was like, oh, you're actually playing the item instead of playing the champion. And so it's like, we had a lot of these patches in the Mythic system where, oh, it's the Gale Force patch. Gale Force is really powerful on this patch, and so you just pick the 80 carries that can use Gale Force well, and then you play Gale Force. You don't play Jinx or Aphelios, or Tristana. You just play Gale Force, right? And you play them because, hey, their kits work well with Gale Force, and they're carriers for the power of Gale Force. Same thing with like Everfrost, right? It's like, were you really playing Ahri when you played Everfrost Ahri, or were you just pressing Everfrost on people and then charming them because Ahri had a good way of, capitalizing on Everfrosting people? And so fundamentally, this is the thing that I really disliked about the Mythic system, and I think the strongest argument I had for removing it was that it led to an erosion of one of the core values of League of Legends, was that when you pick a champion, we offer you that champion's experience above all else, right? Because the Mythic items really warped this and presented you with an item experience in a lot of cases rather than a champion experience. So, alongside this, I've removed a lot of items. In fact, there's actually kind of a funny, there was a there was a great line that was said by some of the people that we work with. I think it was one of the QAs that was working on seasonal, was like, the average end step or average Nick change list. They're talking about me. It was like, the average Nick change list is actually just removing the thing from the game because of how many things I removed. I mean, look at this right here. Crown, Everfrost, Leer, Demonic, Stopwatch, and the other Stopwatch. But yeah, removing mythics meant removing a lot of stuff. But as we'll get to, it also means adding some new stuff, and that's very cool. So let's talk about, I've kind of talked about the philosophy of removing mythics in general, but let's talk about the AP system, the mage items. Well, this is titled mage items. It should really be called AP items, but, it is what it is. Let's talk about the AP item system as a whole and my goals for this, and then I'll kind of go through how I approached this project. So when I started working on the AP items system in the beginning, right, this is right after I locked removing mythic items from the game. So I did a pass on removing all the mythics from all systems, right? This was like, oh, I took out Gore Drinker. The initial version, I believe I took out Stridebreaker, and then I think I put it back, but I don't really remember. It was a while ago. So I did a basic pass on removing all the mythics. And then I went to the AP system and I set a bunch of goals. Number one of the big goals was mages have more AP and fewer utility, like fewer like kind of incidental utility stats. This is things like haste. This is things like health. It's still possible to opt into a high haste build, but generally one of the things that I actually think has been a disservice to mages over the years and AP champions in general is that over time, we've, over many years, right? This is not just a criticism of the Mythic system, by the way. This is like just in general, this is true. Over the years, we've removed AP from the Mage system or from the AP system in favor of giving AP champions other stats. And fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with this on an item-to-item basis. In fact, I actually agree with individually on an item-to-item basis. I agree with most of the cases where this was done. Not all of them, like, for example, like Horizon Focus and Shadow Flame. I think it was wrong to have health on those items. But in general, like, I think overall that can be really good for an individual item. In fact, I did this myself on Cosmic Drive, right? I removed some of the AP on Cosmic Drive to put more health on it, or to put health on it at all. The problem statement with this, though, is that it led to a state where all mages, all AP champions ended up with a good amount of haste in their build and often a lot of health. And so we had these mages who, like a random control mage would actually be kind of tankier than they could be. And they would deal less damage, especially to squishies, because then we would also need to give them powerful anti-tank outputs because they had low amounts of AP. And so to be able to interact with tanks at all, we needed to give them these crazy anti-tank outputs like the Mythic Leandries, right? Or Demonic or whatever, right? Because their AP values were quite low, and then they could rely on their bases and Magic Pen and things like this to kill squishies, but generally that wouldn't work against tanks. So we gave them these crazy anti-tank outputs, and this led to this like crazy arms race, where then we put, percent magic damage reduction on Force of Nature, et cetera, right? Like, I don't need to get into this spiraling out of control stuff, but I set a goal that mages, and AP champions in general would have more AP, fewer utility stats, because I think that's a good direction where, hey, we can make the mages actually worse against tanks in this world and better against squishies. And an Orianna with 3 items should be able to threaten you, right, with a combo if you're a squishy. But an Orianna with 3 items probably shouldn't be crazy threatening if you're a tank and you have, an MR item or 2, right? Like, the reality is that I think we've made the mages too generic. All right, sorry for this weird cut in the middle of the video, but I got a delivery in the middle, so I had to go get up and get that. But yeah, anyway, I kind of lost my train of thought when the door got knocked on. I'm going to have to cut that out, huh? Or maybe I'll just leave it. Who knows? Anyway, I really lost my train of thought. I know I was talking about AP items. But yeah, so the general goal I set was raise the amount of AP available for mages, lower the amount of utility stats, because I think it's incorrect that if you're not opting into haste that you end up with these crazy, high haste builds for a lot of these mages, where they could be at max, like they could be at like very close to the maximum amount of AP that they should be getting the maximum amount of AP the system was allowing, and then also have like 80 haste, which I think was kind of wild that was allowed for, especially a lot of the control mages like the Victors and the Oriannas of the world, but even champions like Syndra and, burst mages like LeBlanc is like really wild to me that these champions would end up with either a lot of health or a lot of haste, depending upon their exact build path, and then make almost no trade-offs for that. And so what I'm doing is essentially saying, you have to make trade-offs if you want those alternate stats, but your baseline expectation of AP is a little higher than previously. Additionally, another thing that I also did here was that these items in general, there's more mage items that are more expensive and more slot efficient, right? More large rod items. And so mages actually scale better into 6-item builds because their 6th item is, or like not their 6th item, but like their actual average item slot is better, which means mages now scale better with gold, which is another way of differentiating them from some of the other classes that we have in the game. Or sorry, not differentiating them. Another way of kind of making them more rewarding as carries to invest in, right? Like one of the things you see in pro play a lot is that most mages aren't worth, investing huge amounts of resources into, like funneling, resources into in the same way that like 80 carries are, right? Because the 80 carry 3-item builds are a lot more multiplicative due to things like AS, crit, AD, all multiplying with each other, whereas mages have one big multiplier, which is death cap, and then another multiplier, void staff, like percent penetration. But their other items aren't multiplicative. Like they sort of are, like haste is like a mild multiplier for mages, but not in the same way that like ASAD crit are very consistently all multiply with each other, right? And so making mages better gold scaling means that it's more rewarding when they get ahead, and it's more rewarding to get them ahead in the same way that AD carries are, which I think is actually really good for the game, because we've been in these states where for many, 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 many years, if you have if you're investing in a carry in an organized environment, it's almost always an AD carry. There's like no real reason to invest in any mage long term. At a high organized, like at a high level organized play, unless it's like specifically a Zir who basically scales like an AD carry, right? So, anyway, I kind of got away from myself a little bit. I really lost my train of thought when the delivery came in, so sorry about that. But what was I talking about? Or what else should I talk about before I get into the actual individual AP items? I think that might be all the stuff I need to cover before I get into AP items themselves. Let me think about that for a bit here. I'm going to cut the recording and I'll be back in a minute. All right. I'm back to talk about AP items, and I've also turned on a new light, which I'm sure you can tell that it's slightly different lighting here because I turned on a light next to me. Anyway, so AP items. So as I mentioned, one of the overarching goals was more AP and less, fewer utility stats, and in general, pulling down some of the anti-tank outputs, in order to make mages and APs as a class better against squishies and worse against people who are building to counter them. Right. One of the things I actually felt was really wrong in the game was that tanks actually even like two, in the 1 to 2 item range, tanks would actually get kind of evaporated much too quickly by generic mages, like especially mages who we wouldn't really expect to be good at killing tanks, like an Orianna, for example. Right. I think it's totally fine if a Cassio can DPS down a tank who doesn't have an MR item, especially, but I think champions like Orianna beating tanks in the 1v1 in a lot of these cases, at like 2 items when the tank has an MR item or a partial MR item, I think is generally probably pretty wrong. If the non-battle mage APs, non-battle mage mages being powerful against tanks is probably wrong unless they are very heavily built and multiple items into a heavily built anti-tank build. And so that's why like the new Leandries is less anti-tank than the old one. Anyway, so that's another thing that I tried to do was skew mages to be a little bit better against squishies and a little worse against tanks. I think I've generally accomplished that. I mean, mathematically I've accomplished it, though I guess there could be things that I didn't consider in play, but I did the math and that's true. And other goals I had were fewer offensive trade-offs for building defensively. What I mean by this is that what you trade off in when you buy like a Zhonya's is less in your immediate burst damage. Like, sure, a Zhonya's could be a Shadow Flame and you could have way more burst damage because of pen and stuff like that. But the Zhonya's that's on live like has very little AP on it. Or I guess I say live. I'm making this video the day of the patch is coming out, so I guess that's technically true still. But the previous version of Zhonya's to this patch, right, is very, very, very low AP, right? And it's not actually even that slot efficient. It's a 3,000 gold item, but it's been pushed pretty far. And it's a very low AP item, and so when you buy Zhonya's, my experience, and I think the experience of most people, is that you generally feel pretty bad about your damage if you go second item Zhonya's or third item Zhonya's even, unless you are very ahead of game pacing. And so it actually like goes kind of counter to the intent. The intent of making Zhonya's cheaper and less AP was actually to make it more accessible. But actually for like that, and that's true for like off users, right? This is true for like supports, and it's true for some junglers who like Zhonya's and things like this, and some like random top laners like Jax, for example. But for the primary, kind of core audience we want for Zhonya's, which is true mages and like AP assassins and stuff like this, actually this version of Zhonya's is a lot less compelling because you trade off a lot of damage. Or sorry, the cheaper low AP haste version of Zhonya's is less compelling because it offers you sort of this like utility haste stat and like a bunch of generic random stuff like armor, AP, health. Armor, AP, and low cost in the active, right? And haste, of course. And so by taking away haste and giving it more AP and making it more expensive, basically what I'm saying here is like, sure, it might not be the item to buy when you're super behind and you're struggling against Zed anymore. It might still be, right? Like it'll be hard to buy in that case because it's expensive if you're really behind. And so in that, in that specific case, it might not be the best thing ever, right? And so, sure, there's a use case that maybe I'm nerfing a little bit here, or but when you buy this, if you are, regardless whether you're ahead or behind, when you buy this, it's a real powerful spike. And so it still offers you the ability to kill people, like the ability to perform your function, right? If you're Oriana and you hit a big ult and you bought a Zhonya's second item, I think you should still do damage, right? Instead of, okay, when you buy Zhonya's, you're basically saying, you're conceding. If you're not super far ahead of game pacing, you're saying, hey, my big moves no longer matter. I'm all about like repeated combos and making sure I never die and being 100% uptime. And I just don't think that's really fundamentally what most mages are about. Like, obviously there are mages that are about that, right? Like, there's Swain exists, right? But we can build that gameplay into their kits. And so generally what I've tried to do here with the AP items was make it so the AP items better support the mages that we have and say, hey, if you're Swain and your kit needs to interact differently with items, that's okay, right? And Swain already does this, right? He has a heal that scales with AP. And so, hey, it's totally okay to give him more AP because that actually also gives him more survivability, right? And so we build these AP ratios into these mage kits to perform this function, and then over time with systemic changes, we've kind of made these modifications such that these AP ratios have a hard time fulfilling their function. And so I'd like to put that power back there, right? Like things like Oriana's shield ratio and Swain's healing on his ultimate and things like this, I think should be really, really powerful, meaningful budget on kits. And so that's part of why I want to go more AP. So I've kind of rambled about AP items in general for a while. I'm trying to think if there's any other specific points I want to talk about, but I think I should just start talking about the individual items. So let's talk about Riftmaker. Vamp is an interesting stat. Now this previously had flat Omnivamp on the item, which I've removed. You'll also notice that Omnivamp is very different now. So what was I trying to do here? Well, the truth is that I haven't changed this Riftmaker much. I tried this, this version after a couple of iterations, and I came to this version and I was pretty happy with it, and so I kept it. The core thing here is that we've always been unhappy with the way that Omnivamp, since we added Omnivamp to the game, which was added with the Mythic item update. We've been really, really unhappy with the way that Omnivamp interacted with the champions that we wanted to buy it, right? For example, Riftmaker was designed with champions like Singed and Mordekaiser in mind, saying, hey, these champions should like this item. It's got, health, AP, little haste. It's got, this ramping effect that makes you do more damage in combat. It should be really good for like a sustained AP pattern. But the problem was that Omnivamp was penalized for ranged abilities. And so what that meant was that if you had a lot of ranged spells or your primary damage was ranged, like Singed or Mordekaiser, for example, buying Riftmaker was just trolling most of the time. Or maybe not most of the time. Like, obviously it was good on Mordekaiser at times because he still had his auto attacks, and which were single target. And the rest of the item was very good on both those champions. But we couldn't make the Vamp good on them because it was penalized for AoE, and most of the damage that they dealt was AoE. And so if we actually made the Vamp good for them with a penalty for AoE, then it would be OP, it would be like not balanceable on champions like Kayle and Gwen, who have a lot of single target damage they deal with their auto attacks. And so it makes a lot of sense to me to change Omnivamp to say, hey, Omnivamp has reduced effect on minions and monsters, which are the targets that we don't really want you perma-healing against. And it heals you for full against champions, right? And it doesn't care what type of damage you're dealing, right? If you're Singed and you get your poison on all 5 enemy champions, you can heal for 10% of that damage that you're dealing. Doesn't care that cloud is AoE damage, right? Doesn't matter at all. That's what the goal is here, right? Is that we can now balance Omnivamp between ranged and melee, or sorry, not ranged and melee, between AoE and single target users, right? However, what I found, probably unsurprisingly, is that when you make Vamp work at full effect on AoE, it's very powerful. And so you have to give it in very small amounts. And so when I tried a version of this Riftmaker with this different Vamp that had that had a version where it was flat Vamp on the item, flat Omnivamp on the item, and then an increased amount when you got to full stacks of full combat stacks, the amount of vamp I could give you on the item and balance it was very, very, very low, right? It just wasn't, it wasn't something that I could give you that was really appreciable at all. It was like 2%, or I think I tested 2% or maybe 3%, and it was like potentially OP at that number, or potentially too strong at that number. I don't remember exact details here. And so what I did instead was say, hey, instead of converting to true damage, which is very powerful, and I actually thought that was really cool, and it was a good way of giving like an anti-tank like overtime output to these champions. Vamp also fits that bar, right? It's also like a fairly anti-tank output to some degree, and we can give you a much more appreciable amount if we gate it behind being in champion combat for 5 seconds. And then the item itself can also just have good stats, right? These are very solid stats for this cost. And so because of all of these things, I'm very happy with the way that this Riftmaker worked out, where, hey, if you stick it out in extended combat as, Singed, Mordekaiser, Rumble, name your champ, you can get this vamp, and it works at full effect on AoE. And it doesn't matter what spell you're using, you just heal for your damage as long as you're hitting champions. It's great, right? This item, I'm very confident that this item actually fulfills its purpose better than the Mythic version did, because the Mythic version was supposed to cover a pretty wide variety of different champions in the like non-mana building AP space. Kayle, Gwen, Mordekaiser, Singed, Rumble. I think this version of the item does a better job of that, or at least if it doesn't, then I think it has the levers to make sure that that's true, right? Like, we can always change the vamp amount, we can change the amount of time you have to spend in combat. We can even change the stats on the item if we need to. Whereas I think the old version of Riftmaker, because of the Omnivamp paradigm, we could just never make it good on both Mordekaiser, Singed, or like on Mordekaiser, Singed, and Kayle at the same time. Because if we made it good for Singed, then it was just going to be OP on Kayle, right? Like there's just too big of a difference in users to actually get the users that we wanted. And so hopefully this version fits better the users that we want. Malignance is a new item, which I personally really like. I am a big Malignance fan. This item has a really interesting history behind it. So I was making a new structure for the mana items, right? And the original structure that I made was that we were going to have a 10 haste mana item, a 20 haste mana item, and a 30 haste mana item. Now, obviously, I ended up scrapping that. Now they all have 20 haste, and this one even has an extra 20 haste for your ultimate. But I was originally doing this so that I could cut 10 haste off of Ludens so that it could be clearly like the burst item that gave you less haste than the other items. And so Ludens was in the original structure that I was making. Ludens was 10 haste, and then Seraph's was, well, okay, that wasn't the original version, but so Ludens was 10 haste. I had Cosmic Drive as the 30 haste item. It was a mana item that had 30 haste on it, and then I had a new item, which eventually would become Malignance, in the 20 haste slot. Now, a bunch of things changed over time, and if people want to hear about the whole, how did things evolve in the mana system and the mage system over time, I can talk about that in some other space, but it would take a long time to talk about the whole evolution, because I went through a lot of iterations. But the short version is, eventually, I ended up with this structure where I had damage item, which is, this item, Luden's Companion. It's a little different than the original Ludens, and so we ended up moving back to calling it Ludens because it ended up pretty similar. But it was like damage item, Seraphs as like the mana stacker item, and then ultimate item, right? Like, item that cares about your ultimate, right? And originally this was just haste for your ultimate. Like I literally tested a version of this item where this hate fog didn't exist, and it was just, hey, here's a cheap Lost Chapter item that gives you haste and then gives you, I think the original version was like 40 haste for your ultimate, or something completely ridiculous. And then I put that into test and I said, hey, is this compelling? Is this interesting? Like, are there champions that would just buy this over Ludens because they want to cast their ult more? And the answer was pretty clearly yes, right? Like a couple tests in, I had people telling me like, oh yeah, I played Lysandra and I had such a great time, just casting my ult more. Like, it was super awesome just having access to more ultimates. People would play like Lysandra, Malzahar. And so basically I got together a list of champions. I had people review a list with me of like what champions really like their ultimate, and looked for an effect I could attach to an ultimate that was actually like really cool and compelling for a lot of them. And dealing damage with the ultimate was the trigger that we came up with that actually made sense. And so since Liandry's already exists, we didn't want to make another dot item on ultimates. And so what we ended up doing instead was a magic shred zone that also deals some kind of like token damage. The damage is mostly just so that you can tell that they're in the zone, whether they're in or out of the zone, because obviously magic resist shred is a lot less visible, even though we have an icon for it that shows up on their or on their person. So the damage is mostly there, and we, damage is also a nice lever. If we, if this item's weak, we can buff the damage. If it's, it's too strong, then we could nerf the damage if we had to. But the damage is mostly there to showcase that, like, hey, this person is in your zone. But the original version of this just gave, hey, when you deal ultimate damage to someone, it just spawns a pool, and the pool is fixed size. And then over time, what we've pretty quickly came to the conclusion was hey, this item is going to be way better on Swain than it is on, like Oriana or whatever, or like anyone who has like a real ultimate, like, because there are champions that can obviously deal a lot of damage with their ultimate over time, right? Like a Swain or like a Victor, like, can deal damage to you multiple times with their ultimate. And so since the original version was a trigger that was just purely, hey, this ultimate deals, if you take ultimate damage, you get a pool under you. That's flat it. Like, that's the end of it. It just paid out the people who deal ultimate damage multiple times. And so the QA that was working on this had this great idea of scaling the size based on how much damage was dealt, which is an excellent idea. Thanks out there to the Triptoid. So we ended up with this item where suddenly we could, and this minimum size, by the way, might be too large. I'm not actually sure. We probably should have tested smaller values than this. But yeah, the reality is, like, yes, with Swain, you can get a bunch of smaller pools. And there's also effectively, there's a per target cooldown. Basically, each target that you hit can't spawn more than one pool at a time. And so you have to wait for the pool that they had before to expire before you apply a second pool. There's reasons for that, again, that's another thing I could talk about. I spent a lot of time talking about this item in particular. But the goal here was like, hey, if you have an ultimate that deals a lot of damage, like a Karthus or like a Vagar or whatever, this item can still situationally be good because you can get a much larger pool, right? Like when you Vagar ult someone, you can get the capped size, which is a 550 radius. That's very large. 550 radius is very, very, very big. That's kind of how we got to this item. Was I was looking to improve the mana item structure because we didn't really want to offer an anti-tank output in the mana item structure because it doesn't. First of all, again, as I mentioned earlier, and I talked about a bunch, was like we don't really want mages having access to tons and tons of anti-tank items. We want those items to be limited and require you to make trade-offs in terms of AP and your ability to kill squishies in order to do that to some degree. Like, we're okay with Void not doing that, but that's beside the point. But yeah, we didn't want to have a ton of anti-tank outputs in the system, and so I ended up coming up with this idea of like, well, a lot of mages actually like their ultimate a lot, care a lot about their ultimate, so we came up with this kind of ultimate-based item. Hopefully this item ends up being fun for people, especially people who like Teemo or Swain. Hopefully this is a fun one for you. I personally have really, really enjoyed playing Teemo and Swain with this item in dev, so hopefully you enjoy it too. Ludens. I had a lot of people asking, like, why change Ludens? So this is going to require a bit of a history lesson. Again, this is another topic I could talk about for a long time, but why change Ludens, right? Like, what was wrong with the original Ludens? The short answer is, wasn't there was something, like, wrong with the design individually, but more so that Ludens occupied a ton of design space where it's like, well, this just has a spell trigger that just deals damage to the person that you hit with the spell. This kind of occupies a lot of design space in the AP item system, and it's so unbelievably generic that it was very hard for us to make any other items or even create like good levers for other for Ludens itself to tune it on different champions because it was so unbelievably like painfully generic, right? And so what I did here was come up with a version of the item which rewards different types of spellcasts, right? The two use cases of this version of Ludens, which are better than the previous versions, are number one, where you're trying to burst down an isolated target, and so isolation mechanics actually matter here. If someone has other, if they're standing in a minion wave, you actually hit them a lot less with Ludens, and so there's actually a very context heavy. Difference with this item, I guess, is a good way of putting it. It's like there's a context heavy difference where it's like you don't get the same output if someone is standing by a jungle camp or by minions or by a bunch of their allies, or if they're Malzahar and they have a bunch of voidlings, right? There's like a bunch of ways in which this thing can deal less damage to them. But if they're isolated in the optimal case scenario, this deals more than the previous Ludens. Or actually, I'm not sure that's true anymore because I think I nerfed it a bunch. But obviously the previous Ludens was a mythic, so this thing has to be weaker overall. But it does have a longer cooldown, doesn't have the refund. So I don't remember the exact details. But the point I'm getting at here is basically, number one, that the isolated burst case should be like relative to overall item power, relatively higher power. Secondarily, if you're consistently dealing spell damage to someone over a long period of time, like if you're Cassio or something, because the repeat shots deal reduced damage, the way that you get the most DPS out of this item is actually to hit someone exactly every 3 seconds. And so if you're Brand and you apply your burn to someone, you will actually get a free trigger of the next proc of the shot charge on this Ludens with your burn, because your burn lasts, I think, 4 seconds or something like that. I don't remember. Someone fact check me on that. But you get an extra proc of the Ludens off that. Which means that basically isolated bursters and consistent spellcasters get extra value from this Ludens. And there's also a situationally variable component to this, which is how many, like allies does your target have nearby. And so this provides a bunch of different ways in which we can provide context and different users to Ludens, right? Like if it ends up that battle mages don't have enough items in this system, well, then we can just make it so that the cooldown on the shot charges is lower and the damage is a little lower, or the repeat damage, or you can hold more, or the repeat damage is lower, or whatever. We can tune this to be more oriented towards battle mages. If we want this to be more assassin like burst mage, oriented item, for the LeBlancs of the world, then we can we can make the repeat penalty lower. And say, hey, when you have full stacks of this thing, it can do a lot of damage in burst to people. And so it gives us a lot of extra, kind of contextual levers to work with the item and make it, tuned to be good on the champions that we want, which is what I really like about this Ludens. As for the actual other context, I won't go into the full story, but basically the short of it is that when we were working on this full AP items rework, one of the things that we did was we did player labs. If you don't know what player labs are, basically this is bring in a bunch of players and have them play. So we brought in a bunch of mage players to play at the Riot office and had them test out the build. And at that time, it was still the mythic, basically mythic Ludens with less mechanics and less damage, right? It didn't have the refund; it just did less damage. It didn't have magic pen on it. And so I built all the other stuff at this point was in, all the other items were in, and all the other changes were in. Not exactly the final versions, but there was a bunch of other changes to the system. And the feedback that we got very consistently was, hey, this new mage item system was cool, but I spend most of the game building or sitting on this same item that I've been building for the last 5 years, right? And so a lot of people felt like Ludens was due for a change. Basically, was that, hey, Ludens has kind of been, especially for if you're not a super high skill player, right? A lot of the high skill players have more recently moved over to to Liandry's or to Everfrost in the Mythic system. But if you're someone who is an old time mage player who played even before the Mythic item update, who built Ludens, and especially if you're a lesser skilled player who continued to build Ludens, you've been building Ludens for years and years and years and years. And so if I tell you, hey, we've updated the mage item system, but you spend most of the game building the same item that you've built for the last 5 years, it's very hard to tell you, hey, this is a whole new system, check it out, it's really cool, when the item that you're building for most of the game or sitting on for most of the game is the exact same. And so that was a good reason to kind of mix it up in a way that we felt like was an overall better item. Also, by the way, I changed this build path. I think this build path is awesome. You get to build an alternator in your Ludens. To tell you the truth, I'm not actually sure why no one did this before me. This is kind of one of the things where I'm like, I made this change, and then I was kind of just sitting there, and I was like, this just kind of makes sense. I'm not sure why no one thought to do this before. Obviously, literally in the previous version of, right before this, Alternator had health on it, and so you couldn't do this because then Ludens would have to have health. But, in the previous versions of the system where, it was, Revolver and there was damage on auto attack or whatever, I'm not really sure why no one tried building that into Ludens. So, not really sure what's going on there, but this build path is kind of awesome, so I recommend trying it out. Now let's talk about Storm Surge. So Storm Surge is a cool item, maybe even a little too cool. We'll see. But Storm Surge was originally, this is the last new item I made. Storm Surge was originally designed as a greed purchase item for AP Assassins. So like what we noticed when we were doing out builds in the original version of the system that didn't have Storm Surge was that we would get into this, or we would get into this spot where we look at champions like Elise, like Diana Jungle, Evelynn, these kinds of champions, especially AP junglers. We would look at their builds and say, well, maybe they probably just go back to building Proto Belt, right? Which is what they did back in the olden days before the item update. A lot of these champions, right? Like, or maybe they build Lich Bane. In some cases, right? Like if you're talking about like an Echo or an Evelynn, but obviously Fiddlesticks is not going to be Lich Baning. And we felt like their options were kind of lacking. And so I built Storm Surge as a snowball option for these champions. Oh, I actually didn't realize this doesn't have the update. Okay, well, I'll have to fix that. I'll have to message Ruru about that. But I originally built this item primarily for AP junglers and AP assassins. And this actually has a ranged melee split, by the way. So ranged champions deal a little bit less damage than this with this item. But I originally designed this. That's why it has movement speed on it, and why it's like a cheaper item than a lot of the other items, is that it was designed for, hey, I'm Elise and I'm ahead. What should I buy as my first item? That's why it builds out of Alternator. Was you could buy your Alternator to build into your Proto Belt if you're Elise or if you're Evelynn or whatever, or into your Lich Bane, because Alternator also builds into Lich Bane now. And so it was made to be a flex option as a snowball item. And that's also where the gold comes from. Was originally that this was a lot more gold, and it was more of like a snowballing item. I moved away from the snowballing thing specifically, first because Medjai's already does that, and second because it was kind of messed up when it gave a lot of gold, unsurprisingly. But the gold is still a good way of like tracking that you actually got the Storm Surge kill. Obviously the big lightning bolt is too, but sometimes there's no one else nearby and the big lightning bolt doesn't do anything. So anyway, I built this item for AP Assassins, and then it turned out that this was just like a really fun item, and so I tried to open it up more to mages when I initially made this item. Like, it was, I made this item, and I was like, hey, this is my new AP Assassin, especially jungler item. And then I put the item into testing, and then I turn around, and the next thing I see is that both mid laners every game are building this item second. And so I was like, okay, hey, if you like the item, you like the item. I don't think there's anything wrong with the gameplay fundamentally for mages of this item, but I do think it should be better on the melees who have a harder time triggering the effect. And that's why you don't see this here, but there is a ranged melee split on this item. It does deal more damage for melees. And so hopefully that will enable us to tune the item to be acceptable for mages who have an easier time triggering the Storm Raider and Storm Surge effect. Oh, this should actually say Squall. This isn't the most up-to-date tooltip. That's why it doesn't have the ranged melee split, is because this is pulled from an older tooltip. That's my bad. So I'll have to get that updated. Anyway, for those of you wondering about the origins of this item or like why it's themed like this, Storm Raider Surge was a old Keystone Mastery in the pre-rune system, which said if you deal 35% of a champion's max health within, I don't remember if it was 3 seconds, but within some amount of time, you get a bunch of movement speed and slow resistance. So it was kind of like the phase rush of its time, but very few champions actually wanted to use it, because if you could deal that percentage of a champion's health as damage, then you probably could kill them if you were like a assassin or whatever. And so it was mostly used by like the old Aurelian Soul and a couple other champions. I think Talon also took it some. And so that rune really, like that mastery really didn't work that well. It basically had no users almost. But I didn't think the input paradigm was bad, because it's really a compelling input paradigm. It's like, hey, target squishies and this thing is easier to trigger. And then on the Storm Surge specifically, we can give you an output that's also better against squishies. And so we can kind of double up on the, hey, here's an item that's easier to use against squishies that's also good against squishies. And that's why I targeted it as an assassin item. And the interesting thing actually is that originally it didn't have movement speed on it. This movement speed, I originally didn't have this on there, but we ended up wanting a place to put some power on the item that was not pure damage. And so I put the movement speed on, and at that time nerfed the damage a little bit from where it was, so that it's not exclusively only for just dealing big damage. It also like speeds you up. Um, Also, light tip, by the way, because this does have a range melee split, as I keep saying. The range melee split is checked when you apply Storm Surge to the, or when you apply Squall to the target, which is the debuff now. That's the name of the debuff. And so if you're Elise, I recommend transforming before you apply the debuff if you're going to build Storm Surge. Because it does not check when you deal the damage, whether you're melee or ranged. It checks when you apply the buff. So, just a small little tip for any Elise players out there. Or I guess if you're playing Jace and you're building Storm Surge, but to be honest, I think if you're playing Storm Surge Jace, then you probably don't want my help. I think you're probably looking for more professional help, I think. Anyway, I guess this also applies to Nidalee. So like theoretically, if you like throw a spear and you think it's going to hit and you think it's going to do 35% of someone's health, you should transform into Cougar form because then it'll make your Storm Surge do more damage. So anyway, that's Storm Surge. I don't think there's anything else too much to say about this other than that I really like this trigger. I think this trigger, by the way, could work for a AD assassin item too. Maybe even like I think there's a bunch of space for triggers like this in the game, like dealing a certain amount of damage. Like we could even make this a flat number, which would be cool. That scales with like enemy level or something. I don't know. Like there could be cool versions of this. I think this is a good trigger. It's just the actual original version, which was Storm Raider Surge, just didn't work because the output didn't make sense on that for that input, and so. That part didn't work. But yeah, Storm Surge, cool item. Might be too powerful. I did nerf it, by the way, if you're watching a lot of the like Champions Queue or something like that. This version is a little nerfed. Also, like it has less magic pen and the cooldown is longer. But might need more nerfs. Who knows? Might be fine. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's a very fun item. I recommend it. I really like the big lightning bolt. In a playtest the other day, someone actually stole blue buff with the the Storm Surge lightning bolt if they off of their enemy death, which was very cool. They were just like fighting, someone by the enemy blue buff, blew them up, and it stole the blue buff, which was awesome. So if that happens to you, please send me a clip because that sounds awesome. Rocket Belt, this is basically a reversion, very similar to the old version of Proto Belt. The main difference is that, haste is different from CDR. This gives 15 haste instead of 10 CDR, which actually is generally better when you build it first. Like it's actually giving you more reduction of your cooldowns on your first item. It also does a little bit more damage, I believe, but the way that the bolts is a little bit different. Bolts work is a little different, so it's a little bit less good for wave clear because I didn't actually change the bolt behavior from the mythic version of this. So it's not as good for wave clear, but it does do more base damage. Not too much to say about this, other than that the main reason why I reverted this wasn't because it was easy. Like it wasn't because I was like, oh, I know that this works. The compelling main reason why I reverted Rocket Belt was because this is one of the few items in the game that we know works and is satisfying at a really low price point. And I think it's actually really important that people spike at different amounts of gold. This is one of the reasons why I really dislike the Mythic system. One reason why I don't think, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the other reasons why I disliked Mythics was that Mythics making sense meant they all had to be relatively similar in cost unless they were support Mythics, right? They all had to hover around 3,000 gold, right? That's why all the Mythics will cost around 3,000 gold. Was because the Mythic system didn't really make sense if they didn't, right? But that meant that power spikes and buys really concentrated around this singular window into the game where everyone was hitting around 3,000-ish gold, and then we made supports match that window at their amounts of gold too. And I think that's actually really bad and boring for the game, right? When people spike at different times, that's actually interesting, right? When it's like, hey, we can win this dragon fight because we have cheaper first items than them and we completed our bases, and we bought our items. That's cool, right? Like that's really cool when it's like, hey, you're playing Elise and you want to fight over the second dragon because you have your rocket belt or whatever, or and you know that the enemy, Hecarim doesn't have his, eclipse or whatever. I think that's actually a really compelling decision, or like really compelling, maybe not decision, but really compelling part of the game is that people spike, especially first items, spike at different times in the game. And Rocket Belt is just one of the best, like Proto Belt being a cheaper item is one of the best ways to do that because we know that it's an item that can be really satisfying at a lower price point. And so that's the kind of main reason why I literally reverted this to 2,500 gold and I never changed it, like the price. I never even considered changing the price because I just didn't think there was a reason to. Haunting Guys is back. This version is a little cheaper than the previous one, but it doesn't quite give you as much damage. I don't remember the stats. I don't remember the stats of the old one, but this is just like, I didn't want to make a crazy high cost component, like the same as the 1,500 gold Haunting Guys, but I think having a more expensive-ish, AP plus health component is good for the game, and so that's why I made this. This item builds into both Leandries and Riftmaker now. And that's part of why I wanted to make this was because it makes a lot of sense to build this into Riftmaker, and having this component makes a lot of sense for the AP HP system as a whole. Because the champions that we want buying the HP plus AP items, we generally want them to be interacting in sustained combat, and so it makes sense to put the Madness passive on Haunted Guys into that space. So I like that a lot. Alternator. Changing it from the health, which I really disliked, to pure AP. This is now a very powerful component in lane and just in general. It's like a very, very, very powerful like AP spike that gives you a lot of damage. And because it builds into Ludens, there's now a build path that actually includes this that goes into a mana item, which was previously not true. So I have a lot of items that build out of this, Storm Surge, Shadow Flame, etc., Ludens. Flexible component, really, really cool. I like it a lot. Leandries. This is mostly a reversion. It's not a straight reversion because this version does not have the doubling damage on movement impaired enemies. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is that Leandries and Rylai's already have the same input paradigm, right? They ask you to deal spell damage to people frequently, right? And so having a direct synergy between those two items, I think, is kind of nonsensical when it's like they already have a direct synergy in that they have the same input. It doesn't really make sense if you have paired inputs to also pair the outputs and say, hey, this output's twice as powerful if you have this other output. I think that's kind of strange where it's like Leandries Rylai's will still be a very powerful combo in this world, but we don't have to tune Leandries around always dealing double damage, later in the game. If we want to, we can always make it scale with level or something like that, right? Which I think is a much more sensible way of scaling it because this means that you don't have to buy Rylai's. And so I've tried to open up other build paths for dot champions. Like, for example, we'll get to Shadow Flame later here, where Shadow Flame I tried to make into sort of the greedy damage build for these dot champions, which can be good under some circumstances. I hope that's true. And you don't feel like you're missing out on the Leandries Rylai's synergy because your Leandries just does more damage baseline, but doesn't double when you have Rylai's, right? So, yeah, that's mainly the reason for this. And the main reason why I have the monster damage cap is because there's going to be a bunch of users of this again who are junglers. This is not like this line is not intended to be like I don't want Swain to be able to do Baron. It's more of a Zach builds this item, Amumu can build this item, and we know that if the monster damage cap is high enough, like it was on Demonic, that it substantially speeds up their clear in ways that are not healthy for the game. And so this cap has to be lower because we've made the item a lot more accessible. This is very similar in shape to Demonic for champions like Zach, Amumu, etc. Lilia as well. So that's something that we have to do there. But I would be happy to be wrong about that because I would be happy to raise this cap back up if it turns out to not be necessary. Horizon Focus. So new version of Horizon Focus. I tried a lot of different versions of Horizon. Unfortunately, most of them ended up being not very good. One ended up being very, very fun. I talked about this on Flox's stream that we did when the PB went up first for the 14.1 patch. But I tried a really cool version where I stole the True Shot Prodigy augment from Arena, the thing that shoots Ezreal ults if you snipe someone at long range. That was very cool, but we already had too many damage procs in the system, and in general, we don't really want items to be casting spells, kind of talking about the same thing I was talking about earlier with the Mythics, which is like we don't want items that have their own patterns and stuff like that, or at least overly leaning too hard into their own patterns and casting their own spells and stuff like that. So I moved away from that. Instead, this is a cheap item, it's 2,700 gold. Still offers solid amount of AP, very solid amount of haste, and the long-range passive. The cool thing about this version is that this offers a lot of vision. So I tried a number of different utility outputs because obviously there's, I've made a bunch of other items like Storm Surge and Shadow Flame that are very compelling for damage. And so what I tried to do here was a utility output that can be accessed by artillery mages particularly well, and some control mages that have longer range as well. So primary audience that I was looking for here is like Lux, Ziggs, Xerath, Vel'Koz, Zoe, and even some of the control mages that have longer, range abilities, like potentially like the Victors and maybe even the Orianas of the world. But the goal here is that this has a utility output that is sometimes valuable, but often just the reason why you buy this thing is the stats and the damage, right? Um, the vision output is kind of cool because it can provide a lot of value for these artillery mages, like Xerath in particular has a lot of synergies where if you hit your first R shot, you get a huge vision around them and you know if there's anyone else in the area that you should be shooting instead. Similar things can happen with like Ziggs when he's throwing bombs at range and stuff like that. But the primary goal of this item is to provide the kind of unique potential second item for a mage subclass. So one of the things you'll notice if you look really hard at the item structure for mages is that there is a unique item for each mage subclass that they can buy in the second slot. So what this is for control mages, this is Leandries, right? You have Leandries back if you're playing like a Victor or an Orianna and you're just trying to burn things down. You can do that, right? If you are a burst mage, that item can be Storm Surge, but it was originally intended to be Shadow Flame, actually. And that's supposed to be like, hey, you're a burst mage, you're LeBlanc or whatever, you're trying to assassinate people, here's your burst item. And then for artillery mages, it's Horizon Focus, right? Where, hey, if you're Ziggs, you probably don't want to build a Shadow Flame all the time in the second slot. And so I'm giving you a much cheaper second spike that has a bunch of haste on it so that you can repeatedly spam your abilities at range. And then I'm giving you Vision, which is a utility output that you should want sometimes. This is obviously going to be pretty attractive for support champions, right? Like Xerath support probably really likes this item second, partially because it's cheap and partially because it provides a utility output. And yeah, I think people will be surprised by this. I think a lot of people, in fairness, it's like this item it doesn't read super well, I don't think. But I actually think it plays pretty well when you play with this item. Sometimes it's just like, I've had some experiences playing in playtests where I'm Ziggs, I throw a random bomb, I hit a bomb at the edge of its range, it pops, and I see the enemy jungler, off to the side, and I'm like, oh, actually that's really useful. Or, oh, I play Xerath support, and I hit someone with a max range Q. I see that someone is missing from the enemy team, and I'm like, oh, we should engage. We know that there's only 4 of them here or whatever, right? Like small things like that, I think end up adding up for this item, which is really cool. As for one of the questions I've seen people have, which is like, why remove the slow and immobilize trigger? It's mostly because this item was already good, right? Like this item was not an item that was unpowerful on live, right? And so I had to cut power somewhere. And so cutting power in the consistency, which is like lots of champions can consistently apply a slow or an immobilize to people with the Horizon Focus. And so cutting the consistency of the power was an easy way for me to give this a lot of stats, make it cheaper, give it a secondary effect that is actually something that's really appreciable. That having been said, I don't expect this to be a super popular item because it's an item that I designed for a class of champions that there's not very many of, like a subclass of mages that there's just not that many of. So hopefully it'll be really fun for them, for the Ziggs and the Xerath players. But this is just a tough item, to tell you the truth. Like I tried many, many, many different versions of this item, and most of them were not very good. One of the ones I tried, for example, was like an anti-tank version of it, where it gave you increasing true damage against targets, like additional damage as extra true damage based on how far away you were. And it was like okay, but it was kind of, people were generally confused as to like when they were supposed to buy it, so it was tough. I tried a lot of different versions of this item. Most of them felt kind of unsatisfying or confusing. And so here's where we ended up, which I think at least the vision stuff can be, like there are moments when it's really powerful. So that hopefully will be good. Seeker's Arm Guard. This is one of the changes I've seen people most hyped about, which is that stopwatch effectively doesn't exist because you have to pay 1,600 gold in order to get stopwatch, essentially. And it's, and you really, to get full value, you kind of have to build the whole Zonias because otherwise you have this like, AP armor, like AP, like very low armor slot in your inventory that costs a very high amount of gold. I removed stopwatch for a bunch of different reasons. Specifically, merging it into Seekers was a cool idea that I had after talking with August, when August was actually talking about how he was like, hey, I think you should remove stopwatch, or I think stopwatch is bad for the game, but it's really good for mages. And he was just, he was just giving me problem statements, right? He wasn't even giving me any solutions. What's up with that? But he was saying like how he really liked how stopwatch, worked for mages specifically when they were building Zonias, and it was like, oh, that use case is really compelling, but the rune version is like problematic, was his argument, I believe. And after that, I was thinking like, okay, well, how can I preserve the use cases for mages while mostly removing or reducing the use cases for non-mage champions? And one of the easy ways to do that was, well, we could give stopwatch stats and make you pay for those stats, and then it's a way bigger investment. And that's kind of how we ended up at Seekers, because I was also looking for a way to make Seekers more interesting. Because truthfully, we've had this stacking paradigm where you have to stack minions to get extra armor onto Seekers, and I don't think that's really ever been interesting or satisfying. And the only times when it's been powerful, we've immediately nerfed the item. And so making it into a different, more expensive item that we can be more accepting of being powerful in specific ways, I think is a way, way, way more acceptable way of approaching the kind of whole Seekers situation, where it's like, yes, this item kind of has to be powerful to do its job of, enabling mages to exist against certain ADs in lane, like Zed, especially from behind. But giving them a one-time stopwatch when they do that, instead of this weird stacking paradigm that then, is like completely unfeelable and is completely unsatisfying, I think is a way, way, way better way of approaching it, where it's like, it's very clear whether your usage of Seekers was good or not, where oftentimes with the stacking paradigm, it's not clear, like, was it the right buy? Was it good? Was it bad? This Seeker should be a lot more clear why you should, or like when it was a good purchase and when it was a bad purchase, and when it was, hey, this is the right purchase, but you used it wrong, versus like, this was the right, this was the wrong purchase. It didn't matter how you used it, that kind of situation. Like, making items learnable, like making it learnable when an item is good and when it's bad, I think it's generally good for the game. So lots of good stuff there. And yeah, that's why I made Triple Tonic, which we'll get to later. Honestly, I need to speed up. I've spent a lot of time talking, and I really haven't even gotten very far into the mage items. Crypt Blooms. This is something having to do with locked slots. If you were someone who reads the dev blogs, you'll know that Crypt Bloom is basically an attempt at unlocking the percent penetration slot for AP champions, not just mages, but AP champions in general. What Crypt Bloom does is says that there is a trade-off in terms of cost, in terms of pen and raw damage, and in return you get some haste, and you get this very powerful healing Nova effect. It's a very powerful teamfight effect, to be clear. So the expectation is that AP champions that are looking to one rotation someone, just burst someone out, like LeBlanc, for example, probably have no interest in Crypt Bloom. Generally, those champions don't generally like haste, and they would much rather have more raw AP, more raw magic pen. However, if your champion scales well with haste, like if they have a lot of utility spells, or if they're not about raw burst, burst and more about training people down, for example, some of the more tanky Silas builds, or some of the Cassio setups, or some Swain builds, and you still want some magic pen, say you're against someone who has an MR item, Crypt Bloom should be a really compelling option sometimes. Also, supports can get some value out of this, though I will note that the base value on the heal is quite low, and it mostly scales with AP. And so this item is a lot better if you're stacking AP, and actually having a full income build than it is if you're like a support and don't have as much gold. But the goal here is to create at least a somewhat compelling decision point for some champions, and for some champions to just default to Crypt Bloom as a way of providing extra utility to their team. And free up all AP champions from feeling like they need to buy Void Staff. There's not really much else to it. Like, we tested a few different versions of this item, but mostly they were all some kind of healing team utility effect, and that tested reasonably well, and so that's why we ended up here. Potential modifications for this item in the future. It might be that it needs to be cheaper. I'm not actually 100% convinced on that. And it might be that this AP ratio is too high, too low. I'm not really sure. We've never really had this kind of item in the game before. The healing Nova is very, very large, by the way. I don't remember what the actual range is, but it's like, it covers an entire screen. So you'll heal your whole team most of the time when you trigger this effect. So it looks really good also. I highly recommend buying this item just to see the visuals on it. They look amazing. VFX artists did an amazing job on that one. Shadow Flame, this is an item that is basically directly ported from Wild Rift. In Wild Rift, it's called Infinity Orb, where you crit people at low HP with your magic damage. Here, I expanded it to true damage, which mostly I mostly did this for Vel'Koz. Like, I had a couple people play Vel'Koz in tests, and they were like, I don't have enough items to buy, and I hate Shadow Flame now. It gives me crit only on my magic damage, and I don't do enough magic damage. And I said, okay, true damage too. Sure, why not? So this item no longer has health on it at all. It's a pure damage item. And I think that's great. I think it's great that there are items in the AP system that just say do a bunch of damage. Because I think there should be items in all damage dealing systems that do that, right? In much the same way that there's like, I don't know, Infinity Edge in the AD carry system, and in the AD fighter system, there's like Bork and Rav Hydra, right? It's like these are just big damage items. And like the old Bloodthirster, right? Like with just a ton of AD on it or whatever. I really like big damage items from systems where we expect people to deal damage. And so that's why I took health off of Alternator, was so that I could make items like this. And I believe this actually has 12 Magic Pen. That's another my bad on the putting stuff into the patch notes doc. So sorry, this is actually 12 pen, not 10. And you can see here, this increased to 30% increased damage for damage over time and pet effects. This is mostly to give some extra context for champions that would normally never buy this or would very rarely buy this, like Malzahar and Zyra, etc. I don't think this really matters that much, but at least it makes this a more attractive greed option for like dot champions who normally, in previous versions of systems, have never been able to greed damage, like to have a greed damage purchase, right? Like there's never been a greed damage purchase for like Malzahar and Zyra and like these champion like Brand, because we don't give them great AP ratios because they have access to Liandry's to scale their damage and like burn effects to scale their damage. They have access to other ways of scaling their damage besides raw AP. And I think that's fine, but I believe that they should have good ways of scaling, like of purchasing greedy items that let them do lots of damage at the cost of their selfish, durability or whatever, right? Whatever the cost they're paying is, as long as they're paying an appropriate cost. And so this is the big damage item. So if you want big damage, this is the item to buy. This and Death Cap, I guess, also. Amp Tome. So this is I will actually take the full time to tell this whole story. I talked about this a little bit on Twitter, but Amp Tome is an item with kind of a long history. Well, I guess it's kind of a short history in some ways. It's a history that goes back to the beginning of League of Legends when health potions cost 35 gold, and you didn't start with 500 gold at level 1. Lots of weird decisions were made around that. To tell you the truth, I don't think anyone at this point could really tell you why those multiples were made the price points of a lot of different items. But like, Doran's blade used to be 475, so you couldn't buy any potions with at level 1, for example. And so Amp Tome, for whatever reason, in the original system, they decided you should only be able to buy one health potion when you bought an Amp Tome. And so it was 435 gold. And so you could buy one health potion. Very weird. But health potions were changed to a much more reasonable amount of gold, which is 50. And over time, we kind of changed all the items that didn't make sense in that system, except Amp Tome. And then Amp Tome was just left on its own as 435 gold. It's just such a weird price. Why isn't this a multiple of 25 at least, right? It could be a multiple of 50, which would be even better, right? Which it is now. But why not a multiple of 25? Very, very weird. And this is something that I was furious about long before I joined Riot, right? This is something that I was mad about. I don't even remember what started me being so mad about this price, but to tell you the truth, by the time I was doing interviews at Riot in 2017, this was something that I complained about probably once a week to my friends when we were playing League or something. Maybe even more than that, I have no idea. And so when I interviewed at Riot, at the very end of the interview process, the hiring manager who was hiring me was like, hey, he asked me a few questions, and one of the last questions he asked me was like, if you could make one change to League right now, what would you do? And I said, I would change Amp Tome to 400 gold, because I just think it's ridiculous to cost 435. I just don't understand like what the motivation for that is. And he and the other guy who were interviewing me at the time just like laughed it off. They thought I was joking. But I wasn't. I like legitimately was not joking. Like that's actually what I would have done if I could have just magically hand waved one thing at that time. And that's kind of stuck with me, right? Like when I joined Riot, I used to ambush designers. I'd roll up to them and I'd say, hey, how much does 3 Amp Tomes cost? Tell me right now. And, they could never tell me because that math is just impossible to calculate. It's just unknowable. And then I'd say, hey, how much does, 3 longswords cost? And that's actually pretty easy to calculate, right? And so it's like, I would get people with this difference and no one ever changed it. Now, there's a lot of good reasons why no one ever changed it. One is that you have to redo the entire AP system because there is a rule in League of Legends that pure stat components have to be more efficient. The more expensive ones have to be more efficient than the less expensive ones, because otherwise it is optimal to just stack the low cost component, right? Like this is already, true in some cases with like the assassin items where you stack longswords in your inventory, right? Where it's like these provide the best build path and they provide the most flexibility in your build, so you just build a bunch of longswords, right? There's already a lot of innate reasons why stacking the low cost component is good. Therefore, we say the more expensive components need to be more efficient, right? And so what happens here is that, I just noticed this says 435. That's not true. So what happens here is if you make Amp Tome 400 gold, it's actually more efficient than the old Blasting Wand and the old Needlessly Large Rod. And so I had to buff these items to compensate for changing Amp Tome. However, this worked perfectly. All right, sorry about that. I got interrupted by a neighbor at that time. But yeah, as I was mentioning about the gold efficiencies, I don't remember exactly where I was, but short version summary is the more gold something costs, right, as an individual item, right, like Large Rod, for example, the more cost there is to saving that gold in your inventory, right? There's an opportunity cost to not basing and spending that gold on an Amp Tome. And so the higher cost items need to be more efficient in order to make this system structure make sense, unless you explicitly want people purchasing multiples of the low tier components, or you have another system in place to solve that, right? Like other MOBAs handle this differently, but League solves this by making more efficient, expensive components. And so this requires a lot of change in order to manage this. And what that means is that I had to update the whole system and kind of necessarily raise the amount of AP in the system in order to make this change, which ended up being perfect because I wanted to do that anyway. And so it's kind of this perfect harmony of like, I've wanted to make this change for years, literally over 6 years at this point. Like, again, I started working right over 6 years ago, and I talked about this in my interview. And so I made this change, and then that kind of had this fallout of doing these two things, of raising the AP on Wand and Rod, and then that naturally led into the system itself having more AP naturally, which was actually perfect because, again, that was one of my kind of core goals for the system. And so this is just kind of like an example of like a perfect, like, wow, this small change snowballed into all these other things that I wanted. It like accomplished this goal of making this component make more sense in the game, and also increasing the amount of AP kind of by domino effect, which is really awesome. It's really, really awesome. One of my favorite things in game design is when everything kind of lines up like that, when it's like, oh, you make this small change here, and then that leads to this change here, and then that leads to this change here, and then it's like boom, 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 get all your get multiple outcomes that you wanted all at once. So really fun when that lines up like that, and this was basically the perfect confluence of all of those things. Zonia's Hourglass. So stasis is unchanged. I kind of talked a little bit about. Yeah, this is supposed to be. Here, let me start writing up a list of these things. Sorry if the typing is really loud. My apologies there. What were the other incorrect things? While I'm looking, I should note these for Riru. Not previously 435 gold. And Storm Surge. All right, sorry about that. I should probably cut that out of the video, but I probably won't because I'm not really interested in spending much time editing, so apologies. There's just going to be a weird, however long that was, 40-second break in the middle. There was another error up here, right? If so, I don't remember it, so it's probably not that important. I think that was it. So I think I've covered everything. So what was I talking about? Oh, Zonia's. So Zonia's Hourglass, more expensive, more slot efficient, in particular, more AP. Main thing here that we're getting out of this is that Zonia's again, I kind of talked about this a bit, or actually, I don't remember. I cut a couple of clips out, so I might not have talked about this in the actual clips that I'm going to be including in the final video. I had like a 1 minute clip that I cut out. I don't remember if I put that in or not. Anyway, so I'll just go again in case I didn't talk about this. But what we're trying to make the Zonias do here is trade off less on your raw burst. Like most mages, we tie their utility outputs or their primary outputs to AP ratios, right? For example, Swain heals more when he has more AP. And he also deals a lot more damage, right? And one of his primary outputs is damage. Orianna deals a lot more damage with AP, but she also shields more, right? Syndra does a lot more damage when she builds AP. Karthus deals a lot more damage when he builds AP, right? And so some of their utility outputs, like Karthus's W, for example, don't scale with AP, but some of them do. And so generally, when we give people, AP champions, especially mages, AP, what we're doing is we're saying they deal more damage, but there also might, in some cases, there will be some utility ratios and some defensive ratios like shields and heals and things like this that will be improved by this. Vex has a high AP ratio shield, for example. And so what we're doing with a higher AP, lower haste version of Zonia's is saying, most of the time, your primary outputs scale with this stat, but you don't get haste, which means you don't get to repeat your pattern as much, right? And so what you get when you buy Zonias, especially in the early slots, like second or even third, what you get when you buy Zonias is that you can still perform your function, but if you miss one of your spells, which is like, this is a core mage gameplay, where it's like if you're Orianna and your Q goes into a bad location, you're kind of screwed, right? Like you don't have any haste. You're more disadvantaged by bad casts, right? Like each bad cast is a higher cost, but each cast has higher upside because you have more AP. And so it's like, yeah, if you hit the big Orianna ultimate, or you hit the big Victor combo, or you get the 4-man Swain ultimate, or whatever, or you hit the 4-man Ziggs bomb, or the 3-man Lux laser, or whatever, right? Like whatever combination. It's like if you hit the big flashy plays that mages should be aspiring to, you will be a lot more effective in this world when you buy Zonias. But you will get fewer opportunities to make those plays. And so you have to kind of pick and choose your moments, which has really always been what we've wanted for the mage class as a whole, is like, hey, you're not about throwing spells out constantly. I mean, some of them are, right? Like Cassio is, right? Battle mages in general are about throwing out a lot of spells, typically speaking. But the core mage gameplay isn't about always using your spell every single time it's off cooldown, right? And so by reducing some of the haste, especially on these defensive items, and giving more AP, the goal is to say, when you build defensively, you do not trade off your primary core outputs most of the time. Now, there will be some champions where that might be true, and we might need to adjust some champions because of that. But as long as this is true in general, same thing with Banshees, we will be happy with this. Also note the Banshees cooldown is lower. Verdant Barrier, this is kind of similar logic to Seeker's Arm Guard, but basically we've never really been happy with the stacking paradigm on these items, where the stacking paradigm is really unsatisfying and not even really that interesting or compelling from a game to game perspective of did you stack this before they all end you or not? It's like that's not even an interesting question really. And so we turned this in much the same way that we turned Seekers into a mini Zonias, we turned Verdant into a mini Banshee's Veil. You'll note this cooldown is very, very long, 60-second cooldown. And so the goal was for it to be very similar to Seeker's Arm Guard, where it's like a one-time use, but we didn't actually want to make a one-time spell shield because you don't have direct control over the spell shield, so a literal one-time spell shield would have been pretty terrible. You would have bought this item in lane, and then it gets poked off by some random spell like a Ziggs Q or something, and you would have been like, wow, that's lame. And so it's just, this one is more expensive than Seekers because it does have more than one use. That's why it's 1,800 instead of 1,600 like Seekers. But we'll see how this pans out. I'm not convinced this item is actually good. I suspect it might need buffs, but we'll see. We'll see how it works out. So Archangels and Seraphs are back to being lost chapter items. I think this makes a lot more sense for these items. Having health on them is really weird because it already has a lifeline shield. And so it's like, if it has a lifeline shield, why is it giving you other forms of defense? Kind of a strange spot for items to do the same thing twice, especially when it's supposed to be a primarily AP item that's like a mana stacking item, right? It's already the mana stacking item. Why is it also a doubly defensive item? Very strange. Anyway, so what we did here is basically revert this to a lost chapter item and then make it fit in the new system. Something that's key to note here is that this version of Archangels is a lot easier to stack when you finish it. And so this version is a lot more accessible. And so if you're a mage and you're under a lot of threat, like you're playing Orianna into Zed, and you're like, wow, it's so hard for me to build Zonias now. I can't, like, I'm behind. I can't build Zonias. You actually can build Archangels, and the expectation is that you'll be able to fully stack your Archangels even if you have no tier stacks whatsoever. I think I don't remember the exact estimation because we were doing this math a long time ago. This was like, I don't know, 4 months ago or something, 5 months ago. The target was that you would be able to stack the Archangels from 0 in around 5-6 minutes on most champions. There will be some champions that are worse, but it's a lot more forgiving, where you can gain this mana a lot more easily. You can store more charges behind the scenes. You gain more mana per charge. Or actually, I don't remember which of these levers I touched. I think it's you gain more mana per charge, and I think you can hold more. I don't remember if I gave you the charges more frequently. Honestly, like I locked these mage items, like these AP items, a long time ago, so I honestly don't remember. Sorry, but basically, I made this thing easier to stack. Is the short version. Also, I thought it was weird this thing had 860 mana, so I just buffed it to 1,000 because this is a cool looking number. The awe is a little bit less. The ratio is a little bit lower because you can buy a lot more mana items in this system. And so one of the things we saw at the old mana ratio or AP mana ratio was that people would just buy like Seraphs and then 2 Lost Chapter items. I think it's really cool if people buy Seraphs and then another Lost Chapter item. Like if you want to buy Seraphs Ludens or Roa Seraphs or whatever, I think that's totally cool. But I don't think you should be rewarded for building like infinite mana items and just get infinite AP. That should be like the optimal build to gain the most maximum AP or anything like that. So this is where we're at. The rest of the numbers I think are pretty much identical if I remember correctly. I think this is the same amount of mana from the shield on live, but honestly I don't remember. Deathcap had to change this item because Large Rod has 10 more AP, so I gave it 20 more AP flat because that's necessary, and then lowered the amount of percent AP. This also kind of doubly served as a nice way of curtailing the very top end because there's more AP in this system. So lowering the percent AP multiplier by 5% was also a nice way of saying, hey, let's not get too crazy. You'll still get more AP in the system overall because you just have more AP on your items. There's just a bunch of 120 AP items that didn't exist before. But you don't get to like 1,200 AP, which is what it like. There were some pretty crazy builds when this thing was 40%. I actually did have a version where it was more expensive, but it was 140 AP and then 40% on here. It was very, very crazy, so I tuned it back a little bit. This is a nice way of kind of curtailing the like really, really, truly crazy stuff out there. Void Staff, basically making this a little more expensive to differentiate it from Crypt Bloom. Crypt Bloom is supposed to be the like kind of cheaper budget, more utility option. This is supposed to be the more selfish, more expensive, greedy option now. So more expensive, more AP. Rod of Ages shrunk the Rod of Ages a bit to 200 gold down. It gives you a little bit less AP, a little bit less health, a little bit less mana. Something to note though is that Catalyst actually gives 50 more HP because I thought this component could just use a buff. Like at 1300, it's just not competitive enough with Lost Chapter. Even though Lost Chapter is nerfed in this setup where Lost Chapter is 100 more gold. I don't think we've gotten there yet. But yeah, mostly this was just looking at historical versions of Rod of Ages, and historically the versions of Rod of Ages that have been most broadly accessible were the cheap versions, where you could buy this thing at a relatively low cost and get it stacking early. I think also one of the things to note is that since Rod of Ages has been added to the game, games are a little shorter than most of the time that Rod of Ages was in the game, and especially since when Rod of Ages has been popular, games are a little shorter since then. So trying to make it a little bit more accessible, I made it cheaper. That's the main thing here, and so I'd be happy to buff this item if it turns out to not be good. I wanted to keep the level because the level is super cool and it's like the most unique, interesting output of this item, and so I tried to make sacrifices where I could in order to preserve the level and preserve it being cheap. Those are the two main principles I tried to keep on this item: were make it cheap, keep the level. And so I did what I had to do in order to preserve those things, like cut the AP, cut the health, etc. Catalyst I already mentioned. Sheen. So this is an item I have really not seen many people talking about, but note that this base AD ratio is buffed, and you... Sorry about that, just a quick sneeze. But you get 50% attack speed while the Spellblade is ready. This is something like I said, I haven't really seen people talking about, but the build path is amazing now. This thing is actually quite efficient. I give you 15 AP for 100 gold and more damage. Mostly I just feel that, first of all, Lichbane I think has been kind of underserved. Or sorry, not underserved. Lichbane has kind of been in an undeservedly weak state since the beginning of the Mythic Item update. The beginning of the Mythic Item update had a version of Lichbane which had a longer cooldown, which was higher damage, and the first patch of the Mythic update was very OP. So we nerfed it. But I think we nerfed it a little bit too hard, and then we adjusted it back to the normal, 1.5 second Sheen cooldown, and we kind of left it in the gutter for a while, I think inappropriately. And so that's why this list includes not just buffs, but also stuff that I think will feel really good. This is something that people tested this and told me it felt amazing. I tested it, and I was like, it feels pretty good. But I had people telling me it was like the greatest thing they'd ever played. So please try out your Victors, try out your TFs, and tell me how this feels, because my hope is that this makes the item feel really good, and that the various buffs I've made to the build path and the AP and the base, the base AD ratio, hopefully make the item actually competitive for some champions, and that it also feels really good. The feels, this is mostly the feels thing, and then the rest of this is mostly the power. So we'll see. But my hope is that this item feels really good. And also, I personally really like this build path. And if you don't, then sorry, but you don't have good taste in build paths. So that's all what I have to say about that. Nashor's Tooth. This is mostly this is a change that I made relatively recently. This is like the last change I made to an AP item, I think, which is that I shrunk it a little bit because I and other people at the time felt that it was inappropriately expensive for being the only APAS item, that like the only true like APAS item. Obviously, Rageblade exists, but like the only true APAS item in the system like was really expensive, and so this made it so that champions like Teemo and Kale actually spiked later than we wanted them to. We want their first item spike to come in a little earlier. This does, by the way, have the side effect of making certain Kaisa builds no longer function. You actually have to build additional AP on top of your Nashors to get your W evolve. That wasn't a primary goal, but like I was fine with that as a secondary effect of this sort of knock-on effect. The big thing here is mostly just shrinking this item a little bit because it was it's a very powerful item, but we don't want these APAS champions spiking super late, and also like Azir also was like buying this item and spiking way later than we wanted. We generally just wanted this item to provide a little bit faster of a spike, and so it's a little bit cheaper, a little bit less AP. Morellonomicon, this is directly related to the fact that we've removed Putrefier from the game. Putrefier generally didn't really serve a real purpose anymore after we removed the ability of it applying to ally heals and shields. And the problem with Putrefier previously was when it applied to heals and shields, it was clearly way better than all the other Grievous items at applying Grievous in teamfights. And so we couldn't make a version of that Putrefier that was actually not just a, hey, if you have an enchanter, they are always the Grievous holder, right? Like, we couldn't make it that way. And so the current version of Putrefier, which just applies Grievous on magic damage, is really just Morello's with extra steps. And so I made a cheaper version of Morello's that has haste instead of magic pen and health. And this item should be accessible for support enchanters if they want it, and also some mages if they really want this effect. But in general, this is just supposed to be a fairly generic item. Maybe it's supposed to have a little bit more haste and be more expensive. Maybe it's supposed to have more AP and be a little more expensive. I'm not sure. But it's very cheap, and it offers you a lot of stats. So trying something new here. In general, we're not super thrilled with how Grievous Wounds is in the game right now, but we're also not like crying about it. But this is mostly a change to try and simplify Grievous Wounds in the AP system a little bit, where all AP Grievous Wounds should now come through Morellonomicon, and so this is supposed to be the most generic version of the item that we can make, which is just cheap health AP. Okay, so that's the AP items. Hopefully that's comprehensive. If not, then I guess I can always make more videos if people really want to know more about this stuff. And so let's move on. So fighter and diver items, I contributed a little bit here. I spent a lot of time talking with the various different people who worked on this. A lot of different people worked on this system, but I did not personally do the work here, so keep that in mind. And so I may be missing some context and not as knowledgeable. And so this will probably start going faster than when I worked on the mage items until we get to the tank items, where we'll slow down again because I worked on those. But Hullbreaker, yeah, as people are aware, this item was pretty frustrating at times. It was supporting a very powerful, how do I say this, or a very important niche, which was split pushing, right? Like split pushers had to be buffed, significantly in order to function in a world with dragon souls and stuff like this, right? And so split pushing had to be buffed, but we've tried to find a different path, which is this Hullbreaker, which does not give the user resistances, right? It doesn't make the user really tanky. It just means that they kill towers really, quite quickly because they get this big bonus damage against them. And so it still allows you to buff up your allied minions. I believe this is less than the live amount of resistances, though, to be honest, I'm not really sure. But yeah, it's still supposed to be a split pushing item, but in a less extreme, more relaxed way, where also this can be useful when you're near your team because this isn't restricted based on being alone. And so Hullbreaker is more intended to be a little bit less of a sharp experience and more of a, it's good for split pushing, but not exclusively only useful for split pushing. Bork, not too much change here. I think this was mostly just changed to try and smooth out the the mythic removals, where like Bork was acting as a mythic for some champions, and so we had to make some changes here. I don't recall the exact circumstances, but yeah, I believe this used to be 14%. I think this is slightly nerfed, but honestly, I don't really remember the details of this. I can't really go into detail on Bork because I don't remember the exact details of all of this stuff. Also, it no longer speeds you up because we have a bunch of other items in the system now that build out a phage that give you movement speed on hit, and a bunch of other movement speed items that we're gonna talk about in a bit. And so the self haste was changed to make room for other items, basically. And so yeah, let's go to phage. This is a revert of phage to the pre-mythic system, where it gives you movement speed on hit. This is just always a compelling item. I was sad to see this on Hearthbound Axe because the build path and the stats were less compelling than for the champions that could actually use it. The movement speed on hit, that is. And so now you'll once again be able to see phage on like Darius and stuff like that, as an actual interesting laning pattern. Eclipse is going to be fully turned into a fighter item. It's more of supposed to be a caster item where you get a bunch of AD, you get some haste. It's not too expensive. It's only 2,800 gold, and it gives you the damage and the shield. The movement speed is removed, so there's not like a ton of mythic mechanics behind this. But this is just like kind of a simple, cool caster item that hopefully should fill in some builds for champions like Aatrox and Riven, like some of the more castery fighter champions, is where this is intended to be good. There's obviously no lethality on this. So this doesn't give you this crazy, kill potential spike, but I mean, it gives you 70 AD. That's a lot of AD. So hopefully that's good for people. Spirit Shojin is intended to be another caster item for more like repeat casters, especially those that really, really need durability. That's just why it has 500 health on it. So it's more intended to be like the beefier, more expensive, less upfront damage, right? Because it's 55 AD instead of 70. And obviously doesn't have that damage proc, where you get this Spear of Shojin, and if you're a chain caster, again, Riven, Aatrox, and you want durability, Spear of Shojin should be really good for you. There will still be some, non-pure caster champions I expect that buy this just because it gives you a lot of the stats that you want, if you're like Jax or whatever. So I'm not sure if Jax still buys this item because obviously Jax doesn't do a lot of spell hitting, but we'll see. I think this item is a lot more compelling, at least as a caster item, than it was as like a generic haste, capstone item. So we'll see how that works out. Mostly a revert of Ravenous Hydra to the pre-mythic version, but with this time with the haste. So yeah, builds out of Warhammer now. We know this is good, or we know that haste has a lot of synergy with the champions that actually want this effect. Yeah, not too much to say here. It's partially this is all because Tiamat is reverted, which is something that Phlox and I were basically like saying we should definitely do from the very start of like, hey, we should revert mythics or we should remove mythics, and hey, let's revert Tiamat. There were like a bunch of things that we had on a short list of like, here's what we want to do in the item system. Like regardless of what we end up doing with mythics, we want to do some of these things. And one of the first ones on the list was revert Tiamat because I think most people will agree that Tiamat was a very satisfying component to purchase and master, and the items that it built out of were really compelling as low cooldown, low impact actives that have some resemblance to the Tiamat. Speaking of which, there's also Titanic, which is mostly reverted to the previous pre-mythic version with the auto attack reset. And yeah, this version also has the big haste on it. So we'll see how that works out. I suspect we might want to remove that in favor of like more health, more AD, but we'll see. This is interesting, though. The Shockwave, also, by the way, I was looking at scripts. The range on this Titanic Hydra Splash is crazy. I think it's like 800 range or something insane like that, or 700 range. I don't remember, but it's really big. You'd be surprised by how far Titanic goes. It doesn't come up that much because people don't really like stand near waves that are Titanicking that much. But man, the range on this thing is crazy. The splash damage. So just keep that in mind. Here's the Tiamat revert. I think most people will be happy to see like, hey, you know, Iron Spike Whip was added because of Mythics, because we needed a active, you know, we needed to split them in order to make the structure of the Mythics make sense. But with no Mythics, you know, we're not bound by those things, and so we just revert the Tiamat and put it back to the way that it used to be, which, of course, people very much like. Hearthbound X, just, you know, we took the Phage passive, or the like movement speed on hit passive from it away, and so it just has stats now. Maybe could have a cool unique passive here. I don't know what it would be, but maybe there's something cool that we could do in the future with this thing. Stride Breaker is an item that we know is compelling for a number of champions to help aid them in their, you know, attempt to stick onto people. This is one of the items that gives movement speed, and so one of the things we were concerned about was like having too many self hastes in the system, which is why like Bork lost its haste. Note that this doesn't deal damage, and this thing doesn't build out of Tiamat, and so it's just a pure non-burst. It's just pure mobility active. It does, however, build out a Phage, so it does give you that movement speed on hit. So yeah, cool stuff here. I actually like this version of Stride Breaker. Just a nice, quick like, hey, if you really value move speed differential, then buy this item. And if you hit a lot of people, by the way, it's 30% bonus movement speed per champion hit. So you can get a lot of movement speed if you hit like 4 people with this thing. Pretty cool. So it rewards you for diving deep if you're, you know, Garen or Darius or whatever, you know, getting in there. Experimental Hexplate. This thing's got a lot of attention because it gives so much ability haste and because it gives you pretty powerful stats when you cast your ult. Cool new item designed by one of, in combination with some of the new people who were working, or not new people, but some of the people who were working on the fighter item system. Yeah, cool item overall. Good mix of stats. It's more intended for divers. I think I've seen a lot of people building it on non-divers, but it's like the original intent for this item was, hey, we want an item to fill in a space for champions like Vi and champions like Camille, and seen a lot of different users who, it makes sense to me. You know, like Master Yi is an interesting one, I think. So yeah, we'll see how this item works out. I think it's pretty cool. Intention as a diver item. We'll see if it ends up actually being a diver item, because I'm not 100% convinced that it actually is. But it's at least an interesting, you know, new item that clearly has some users, I would say. Sundered Sky, I don't recall what the exact original design intent of this was, besides like filling some of the space that's been left in the system by Gore Drinker. And so you heal for some missing health. You know, you get these like for this first attack crit, kind of like Jarvan passive. That's why it's called Light Shield Strike. You know, Jarvan Light Shield. Or wait, is it Jarvan Light Shield? Jarvan's Light Shield. No, I don't remember the lore, so we'll just move on from there. Anyway, the point is that this item is just supposed to be kind of a simple functional item that is just good for a lot of kind of generic fighters. If you don't know what to buy and you're not like super into the cleaver build path, this item should be able to satisfy you. Like this item is just supposed to you know, fill in some of the space that's been, you know, some of the empty space that's been left because Gore Drinker doesn't exist, because we weren't super thrilled about the Gore Drinker pattern where it's like, oh yeah, you turn into like a tank when you're Gore Drinkering a lot of people. And so this version, obviously asking you to attack everyone individually and only healing 6% missing health per attack, is obviously a lot more tunable, a lot more reasonable, even in the big scale team fights. If you get all 5 of these, that's still not a crazy amount of healing compared to something like a Gore Drinker. Tunneler, new item we made, you know, component to fill in build paths. Same thing with Steel Sigil. We made this thing, actually, this one was made specifically by Phlox in order to fill out some of his assassin items as well originally, and then, you know, moved away from there. Wit's End, moving this closer to what it used to be, you know, no AD on this item, pure attack speed, you know, much, you know, powerful on-hit damage. The Tenacity is a new interesting one where the designer who's working on this really, really wanted Wits to be more of a targeted, like, anti-mage output, where he wanted there to be like, hey, if you're playing some of these more AS-based fighters, like the Master Yis of the world, Maw isn't that attractive, and Maw does a good job of being anti-mage by being anti-burst, right? And most mages are relatively burst-focused. And so he was looking for another output to put on this item to make it more directly anti-mage. He went through a bunch of iterations and ended up with tenacity. Yeah, most mages have a CC that they try and cast at you that if you have enough tenacity to get through their CC, then it's a lot easier to kill them, right? And a lot easier to interact with them. And so the intention here was to make this item less powerful as like a generic, I just buy this for the stats kind of item, and more powerful as a, I buy this to counter mages type of item. So not too much to say about that. Trinity Force, mostly a reversion to the pre-mythic version of this. It even has a 33 gold component or completion, which is awesome. So, not anything too exciting about the Trinity Force changes, in my opinion. Pretty straightforward. Cleaver remains a strong item, but I didn't talk about haste. I'll talk about haste when we get to the end of the fighter items, but much lower haste on Cleaver. Oh wait, actually, this reminds me. Did we ever go over Cosmic Drive? Oh man, Cosmic Drive isn't in here. Okay, well I'll have to type that up. Okay, Cosmic Drive isn't in here. Add Cosmic Drive. All right. I'm making Ruru's life really difficult by needing him to add more stuff to the patch notes. Anyway, so Cleaver, haste. So we've overall lowered. We've raised the amount of gold we're like costing haste at. So we say like it's worth more. We're saying it's worth more gold, effectively, and so it costs more to buy items with haste, essentially. And generally lowering the amount of haste on items. And so Cleaver at 30 was just way over what we wanted on a single item. And so we're lowering this down to 20. And also lowering the amount of total armor shred available on this item. And also simplifying the rage passive kind of all around. And alongside this, we're lowering the cost a little bit. Mostly Cleaver is going to be worse. Like, truly, this Cleaver is a little weaker. But also, Cleaver was acting as the mythic item for a lot of fighters. Like, there were certain kind of, like, what we called pseudo-mythics, right? Like, all the Noon Quiver 80 carry items, for example, Cleaver, Bork for some champions, in the mythic item system. And so, it's not just that we're nerfing the mythics alone. We are also generally trying to make sure that items have a relatively constrained efficiency, and so that's part of why we need to nerf items like Cleaver and Bork that were acting as pseudo-mythics in the previous system, because they were just overly efficient in order to compete with mythics on some champions. And so that's sort of why some of these things had to be nerfed on this item. Though it might be weak, we'll have to see. It's possible this item needs to be buffed. All right, sorry about that. Got interrupted by neighbors again. But let's talk about Steraks, because I believe I was done talking about Cleaver when they interrupted anyway. Yeah, so Steraks Gauge. This is, honestly, I don't recall exactly the reasoning for putting tenacity on it, besides that the previous version that gave tenacity on the shield was kind of weird, where it was like, you can't really ever feel this tenacity. It's not really understandable. Like, it's something that, because it's windowed, it was just very, very hard to read and hard to understand. And so we're just doing a different version that hopefully will be a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more understandable and simpler. And so yeah, we'll see how that works out. So let's talk about the tank and support tank items. As I mentioned, this is the system that I personally did all the work on, and so I have a lot of context, a lot of understanding. And so this will probably be longer as I talk through these, but maybe I'll be able to ramble a little less, hopefully, as I've gotten better at this over time. Hopefully, who knows. Hollow Radiance. So this is the MR Sunfire. People have been asking for this for years. I think this was a really good time to do it, because by removing mythics, I had specifically created a hole in the kind of MR itemization where all the mythics kind of covered this. Hey, you could buy a mythic and it would give you health, or it would give you health, armor, and MR. And so it would always make you good against your lane opponent, or at least passable against your lane opponent, especially if they were magic damage. And so this pain could be felt. I think when I was testing this system after I'd removed mythics, it was like, oh, I played Shen into Kennen. I was like, I actually don't even know what to buy. Really, the only thing I can buy is Heartsteel, but I don't really want to buy Heartsteel against Kennen because I can't really ever Heartsteel him, right? And so I was like, okay, I need an MR tank item that goes in the first slot that's generically useful for solo laners in particular. And then I was like, ideally, it would also be good on junglers if possible. And so MR Sunfire made a lot of sense in that space as a first item. And so basically, what I did was I tried to make a secondary passive that would be different from the ramping effect that Sunfire has, right? Sunfire has the in combat ramping, which I kept, which I think is totally fine. And I tried to make a secondary effect. This Desolate effect is just on kill. It just deals 2 ticks of the damage in an area around the enemies that you kill. I had a version where this was bigger on if you got like a takedown on a champion, but it was pretty weird because it didn't really feel like a tank output, whereas the the on kill explosion feels perfectly reasonable because it's just like mostly this happens with minions. Yeah, it's a very cool, very fun effect. Is like I tried a bunch of different things, a bunch of different small things to try with the MR Sunfire. And this was one that was very satisfying, where you can like chain kill minions with this. It's very fun, and you just get a lot of value when you're playing around minion waves with this. And so it's like, yeah, it's the kind of thing that makes a lot of sense for something that's intended to be first item, and you're not really supposed to buy later in the game, because obviously you just don't interact with minions as much later in the game. And so this thing being a first item, having a minion skewed effect makes a lot of sense to me. The intention for this was that it would just be a good item. One of the reasons why I made a build of a Spectre's Cowl was because it's supposed to be good as a first item. Spectre's Cowl is an item that we've kind of neglected for a while as a laning component. I suspect it could probably even be a little more powerful than the version that I made here, but we'll see. Just all around, this is just supposed to fill in the first item MR slot for especially top lane tanks. Because when we removed Mythics, we made it so that you didn't really have items to buy besides like Heartsteel. Unending Despair. This is a new item that was built to fill in like the second and third slot because we moved some items earlier in build paths, like Frozen Heart, for example, is a lot more compelling early on in build paths. And so we had holes later on in builds for the tanks. And so we wanted to make more of a generic team fighting item. And so what I made was this. Interesting thing about this is a lot of people probably assume that this was, you just split Jak'Sho into 2 items. Originally, this was not a drain item. Originally, this was not a team fighting item. It was more of a like sustained combat item. It was supposed to reward you for being in combat with the same person, so it gave you healing over time as you fought champions. But what I realized pretty quickly was like this could lead to very stalemated 1v1s, especially tank v tank, but even tank versus fighter in some situations. The like ramping healing in combat against champions was like not a great design for leading to like very, very stalemated combat. And so I turned towards, hey, what if I made it scale with nearby enemies? And then that immediately was like, oh, well, this is really just the Jak'Sho drain. So why don't I just make Jak'Sho's drain into its own item that, then scales with nearby enemies, right? Notably, by the way, this isn't really Jak'Sho drain in the sense that Jak'Sho drain was 100% of the damage dealt heals you, except I believe it was pre-mitigation healing, although I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't remember. This is post-mitigation, and it heals you for a higher percentage of the damage that's dealt, or higher than 100% of the damage that's dealt. And so it's not really about the damage that it deals. The main reason why it deals damage is because, first of all, I think it's cool if it scales with like Magic Pen and MR Shred and stuff like that, and if it heals you more off of squishies, I think that's actually interesting. And secondarily, if it didn't deal damage and it just like put a line on each nearby enemy champion to signify, hey, you're draining this person or whatever, that's kind of weird. Whereas like, are you draining them, or is it just like a visual signal that more enemies is better? And so making it deal a little bit of damage, like obviously this is not going to be that much damage, I think is a really, really good way of just kind of signaling the item is doing what it's supposed to do. So this item has 10 haste on it. It's possible it's supposed to be more. In general, there's less haste in the tank system, the income tank system in particular, but this is one of the items that still does have haste on it that you can buy pretty generically. Canik Rookern, this is a new item I made that's supposed to be kind of the premier generic MR item outside of the first slot. So in the first slot, you can buy this item, but it obviously has a lot of MR, and it has a build path that's like not super conducive to most of your first item needs. It's a lot of MR and not a lot of health. So, the goal here was to create a generic MR item. Oh, actually, talking about the overarching goals for the tank item system, which I never talked about in the same way I did as the AP system. The main goals for the tank system were improve MR itemization, right, which is why I made Canik Rookern and why I made Hollow Radiance. And what was the other primary goal? Honestly, I don't remember at this point. There were 2 goals. That was one of them, the MR thing. This is the one that I remember. Probably not that good that I don't remember the goal when I did this work like not that long ago, but you know, it is what it is. Heartsteel I kept in the game. This is one of the mythics that I removed in the initial paths of mythic items, and then I added back in because I actually felt like the system could use it. Do note that the damage is a lot lower, and it scales only with your health from items. This is really a big difference because the way that this item works is very different than the current one on live. The current one on live basically says if your kit scales heavily with health, or if your kit gives you a lot of health, this item is incredibly powerful. In particular, if your kit gives you health, like Scion or Cho'Gath, this item is you know, very, very, very powerful because it essentially infinitely scales with itself and the health that you're giving it. You're giving it, essentially, you're jumping it forward in the infinitely scaling portion. And if your kit scales with health, this item just gives you the most health possible, right? And so, like, if you were like a Tahm Kench or a Shen, that's obviously really powerful. Because it gives you a lot of health to scale your health ratios, right? Shen has his E and Tahm Kench has his passive. And so one of the things that I wanted to do here in the non-mythic version of this, which obviously had to be less powerful, was first of all, it has to deal with less damage. And second, you know, because the damage this thing deals is pretty shocking. I think the mythic version of Heartsteel deals pretty shocking. And second, I actually really wanted to break the direct synergy between Cho'Gath or like the Cho'Gath self-health stacking and the Scion self-health stacking with Heartsteel, because that made it basically impossible for us to tune the item for general tank usage. Like, there was never any reason to buy Heartsteel on like Malphite or Maokai, right? And I still think that probably won't be a very common thing to do, but there was really no reason to ever do that because you could never compete with the health that like Scion and Cho'Gath were getting, and you could never compete with the damage that like Shen and you know, Tahm Kench were getting. And so now that you only have to compete with the health to damage ratios, I think it's a much more tunable item for a broader cast of champions among the tanks. I do understand this might be a little confusing for people, but hopefully it will be more intuitive than what I'm thinking, and people will just get it. And because 10% of health from items counts the health that this thing gives you. So it still scales with itself. It just scales with your purchases, your gold, rather than your innate champion kit. It also does help make up for some of the weirdness around Heartsteel, which was previously that your base health and health scaling mattered, which was a very weird way for an item to be relevant. Or for an item to like track your base stats to be more or less powerful. I think is kind of weird. Trailblazer. This is for people who remember the player voting item. Players voted to call this item Trailblazer rather than, what were the other ones? Eerie, Invitation, and I forget what the bagpipes were called, but the other one was like Bandle Bagpipes or something like that. Yeah, so this is what people voted for, which was Trailblazer. Got the most votes. It was actually very close, by the way. It was very close. I think people would be surprised at how close it was. Yeah, this is the kind of support Deadman's Plate. One of the things I wanted to do here when I was working on the support itemization was, hey, we know that supports want to buy Deadmans, and we've kind of always made it too expensive for them because Deadmans was always intended to be more of like a juggernaut-y / tank item. And so we always said that like it's not a support item, and so we don't want to supports buying it. And so I said, hey, what if we just supported supports buying Deadman's Plate, but we made a Deadman's Plate just for them? Originally, this was actually a movement speed item that didn't have the trail. This is an item that went through a lot of different iterations. Like the very first version of this was when you immobilize an enemy, you and your nearby ally just gain a bunch of movement speed for like 3 seconds or something. I ended up moving away from that for a bunch of different reasons. One was that the people who were working on the enchanter items at the time were making Solstice Slay, which we'll get to later, and they wanted that trigger, and we didn't want to stack a bunch of immobilized triggers in the system. You know, we already have Aftershock, for example. And we didn't want to create another system where, hey, you do one thing and it triggers like 5 different events, and, you know, you just Alistar pulverize someone and then you trigger 5 spells or whatever. So I moved away from that. Then I had a version which was really weird, which was like a snowball version, which was like if you've gotten a takedown in the last 60 seconds, you have the trail. But that was weird. The versions with the trail, I actually really liked the trail itself, but I had a hard time coming up with good versions of the trail, and that's why I kind of eventually just said, okay, it's just support Deadmans, and when you fully stack your Deadmans, you just have a speed trail. Funny but not good version of this. Was originally or not originally. I tested a version where it left a trail that raised allied movement speed to your movement speed. So like if you were Rammus and you were powerballing at like 600 ms or whatever, your allies on the trail would be 600 ms. That was really messed up for rotating with like ultimates and like base spells that make you extremely fast. So like Rammus Q and like Scion R. The Scion R was really funny. Scion would buy Trailblazer and then he would like R down mid lane and his whole team could like follow him. It was really powerful in unintuitive ways for like map rotations. This keeps like a lot of the coolness of, hey, more speed means my allies get more speed, but without a lot of the degenerate optimizations. It just gives them 15% instead of raising them to the amount of movement speed that you have. But I think maybe something like that could be done in the future. It could be cool. I don't know. Maybe some champion kit could do that. Zeke's Convergence. This is sort of a revert, but sort of not. It doesn't have any binding effects on it at all anymore, which I just felt overcomplicated the item. It's very simple. Cast your ultimate, get a Storm. The Storm deals damage and it slows people. Fun item. I also think the visuals, the VFX on this are incredible. I highly, highly recommend, especially if you're a support player, try this item out. It looks amazing. Also, it feels really good. It's a really fun item. I highly recommend it. It's just very simple, very straightforward. Cast your, get value around you. You can play your Alistars, your Rakans, some of your other sports like your Leonas can get value out of this. This item is mostly just Zeke's, the previous Zeke's, the mythic version Zeke's, which was not a mythic, right? Just like the version of Zeke's we made for the mythic items. The bind to an ally and immobilize people, and your bound ally deals more damage to them. It was good, right? Like we made a version of that was good, but it was never satisfying, and it was really, really hard to tell what it was doing. And so no one ever bought it because it just wasn't compelling compared to the other support items. And so this one having a visualized effect that you can see and is has a very clear moment of power, my hope is that people will actually want to buy this item rather than completely ignoring it like they did with the previous version. Locket, mostly unchanged, just nerfing down the haste and removing the passive aura. I think this was actually bugged on live, but I'm not 100% sure. Regardless, I removed the aura anyway. And yeah, the rest of it is exactly the same. Well, not exactly, but mostly the same. The passive aura was moderately powerful, but just not satisfying or interesting, really. Like, we couldn't even really make it that powerful, even in the Mythic world, and so just removing it was an easy way of just buying power off the Mythic version. Warmogs, this is an interesting item where I have made it a little more expensive, nerfed the health a little bit, and raised the bonus health threshold to 1300, so it's harder to get this. You can't just like buy a Ruby Crystal and buy Warmogs and be good to go. The goal here was to, first of all, like cut down some haste from the system. Oh, I still need to talk about haste. I'll talk about that after this. Cut down some haste in the system by removing some haste from Warmogs, and also simultaneously create an item that has move Warmogs into a space where it should have some users. The goal I was targeting here was mostly jungle tanks, but I expect some other people to maybe pick this up sometimes, like some top lane tanks. Because this gives you a lot of map mobility, because you get 5% movement speed on the base item and then another 10% if you have the passive on, so if you're out of combat basically. This makes the item very, very good for map rotations. Like if you're Sejuani jungle and you buy this like third item or whatever, you'll be able to rotate around the map really quickly, which I really like. Potentially second item depending upon what your first item is, because this thing gives 750, so you need a lot of bonus health in order to turn the passive on. So you need 550 from other sources. It's hopefully a really compelling like third or fourth item for some tanks that really want to just like move around the map and be fast. And if not, then we can always buff it. We can always get more movement speed. Jack Show is an item that really needed to be nerfed a lot as a myth, former mythic. It doesn't have the flat resistances per stack that it used to have. It does stack a lot faster. Where it stacks at 5 instead of at 8, and it gives you 30% bonus resistances. There's a lot of resistances. This is not unchanged also, that's not correct. Let me type that into my message. Remove unchanged from Jack Show passive. There we go. And so in general, this item is the goal here is for this to be the new tank capstone, which is why I removed Stone Plate from the game. So Stone Plate was previously a tank capstone in a really weird way. It gave you like anti-burst and stacking percent armor and MR in a really unsatisfying way. We know that Jack Show is a satisfying item, and so my hope is that we can turn this into a tank capstone that is satisfying, visualized, and actually interesting. Also, I just kind of have always thought it's strange that like the Stone Plate versions of Stone Plate that have been like anti-burst are kind of weird because tanks are already supposed to be good against burst, and so giving them an anti-burst active is just like kind of a strange thing where it's like, why are you giving this class access to an anti-burst active? Is like specifically like very good on certain champions, like Cassante, for example, who ults and turns into not a tank, right? It's like very powerful in certain situations, but it doesn't really fit the class fantasy where it's like the class fantasy is to just be tanky all the time, not some of the time, right? Like the class fantasy for tanks is just I'm a really tanky tank. And so the goal of Jack Show is to say, hey, if you can survive in combat for 5 seconds, you should be able to get really tanky. I suspect this probably needs a range mod, by the way. Like, we probably need to nerf this thing for range. Although, of course, that makes Urgot sad every single time we do that. But yeah, we might need to do a range mod on this. We'll see. I haven't figured that quite out yet. Deadmans needed to change a little bit in order to fit in the new Deadmans for supports. So we took the movement speed slow from Deadmans and put it onto Trailblazer, since that's a more support skewed output than damage. And what we did here instead was to give it slow resistance. And so the point here is to push Deadmans more towards the Juggernaut space from the tank space, because this item actually has pretty bad stats. I mean, for 2,900 gold, giving you 300 health and 45 armor is pretty bad. And so the goal here was to say, hey, Juggernauts are actually the ones that can afford to spend more gold on an item that doesn't give them the most, raw tank stats. And so it makes sense to give them a utility effect that's really, really Juggernaut skewed, which is slow resistance. Champions like Mundo and Adarius, Nasus, sometimes you have a hard time dealing with slows, and you can't always buy Swifties. In fact, most people never buy Swifties. So the goal here was to basically make slow resistance a more accessible stat for Juggernauts, who generally should want that. And so, yeah, we'll see how this works out. I hope that Juggernauts really like this item, but this is really hard to get testing on. We set up some comps and had some people build it, but it's not the most feelable mechanic. It's kind of hard to tell when it's working, but it'll hopefully people will figure it out. Rando and Zoman and Force of Nature are pretty similar changes, where basically I nerfed their base value slightly and then made them better against the things that they're supposed to be better against, which is to say I buffed the crit reduction by 5% and nerfed the armor by 5. That stuff's, the rest is unchanged, but it's supposed to be more good against crit, less good generically against physical damage, because we have Unending Despair for that now if you need a generic teamfight armor item. Force of Nature is, of course, an item that has been nerfed quite a lot. I think it's just kind of, the previous state was kind of weak, and so nerfed the base MR and said, hey, you only need 8 stacks of Steadfast instead of 10, and you get a lot more MR, 70 MR. I don't remember, I think on live it's like 30 or something pathetic like that. I don't remember, but I buffed this a lot. And so Force of Nature should be kind of Adaptive Helm-like, where it's like, hey, if you're dealing with a lot of magic damage, or you want an MR item that gives you movement speed, Force of Nature should be the thing for that, right? Like, Force of Nature is supposed to be the MR item that's like, hey, at a baseline, it's not as efficient as the other MR items, right? Like if you're talking about Hollow Radiance or Caenic Rookern or even Visage, right? But if you care a lot about movement speed because you're Volibear or Udyr or whatever, it's a really attractive option. Also, if there happen to be lots of repeatable magic damage sources like a Cassio or a Rise on the enemy team, Force of Nature should also be really good because it gives you this stacking passive. And so the situations where both of those things are true, if you happen to be Volibear against, Rise, this should be really, really good. So basically giving it some situational context or some contextual power for both its users and its counters. So trying to get it to have a real space in the shop that isn't just it's bad. Because I think that's currently where it was, is just over nerfed and just in a state where it wasn't really worth buying unless you really cared about that movement speed. Iceborne Gauntlet, mostly you don't need to worry too much about this. It's mostly simplified. I removed the doubling the slow against the primary target and the damage reduction that nobody even knew existed, and changed the stats up. It's lower stats, lower cost, and just a simple non-mana version of the old Iceborne, right? It's just the old Iceborne, but without mana for the most part. So it's a little bit more accessible for different champions that might want Iceborne, but don't necessarily want mana. For example, like Shen. If you want to build Iceborne on Shen now, it doesn't have mana on it, so you don't have to feel bad about that. And it's also very cheap, so it's a good early armor item if you do want that. Fimbulwinter I just felt was kind of weak, so I just buffed it. Sunfire, mostly the same. It just has lower base damage. It's really not that different. Or lower base damage and 50 less health, because it was really strong. This item was also kind of serving to some degree as a pseudo-mythic, so this is kind of part of the group of like Bork and Black Cleaver and like the Noon Quiver items that was kind of serving as like a pseudo-mythic for some champions, and so, just cutting down efficiency here a little bit. Knight's Vow, just changed the build path mostly. Stats are a little bit different. It's the same passive and active. Frozen Heart, a little bit less armor, much cheaper. Personally, I think it makes a lot of sense to make Frozen Heart a cheaper item. I think the versions of Frozen Heart that have been most interesting and most like worth fitting into builds or worth thinking about are the versions that were cheap. And so I made this item cheaper, so it's more accessible to supports. I would have loved to have done more work on support tank itemization. I just didn't have enough time. And so one of the things I could do was open up more items like Frozen Heart to them by making them cheaper. And so that's one of the things I did do, was make Frozen Heart cheaper. Same thing with, that's also part of the reason why I buffed the cost on Fimbulwinter's Approach, because, I wanted champions like Tarek to actually be able to buy the item and not feel terrible about how expensive it was. Okay, so before I get into assassin items, let me talk about haste. So a lot of people don't recall the origins of haste, right? Like haste, or like don't know why haste was added to the game over CDR. So CDR was a system where each point of CDR just reduced your cooldowns by that percent, right? If you theoretically got 100% CDR, you would have no cooldowns, right? This type of system is very dangerous. It's what's called asymptotic scaling, because the more CDR you got, the better CDR was, right? Going from 30 to 40% CDR was significantly more powerful. You were getting much, much more reduction of your cooldown effectively, or like relative to your current cooldown, than you were going from 0 to 10, right? So like the first 20 CDR was worth a lot less than the second 20 CDR. And this is why CDR had to be capped, was because CDR kept getting more and more powerful as you got more of it, right? And so the advantage of haste is that haste has linear returns. Each point of haste does exactly the same thing as the amount before it did. And so that's why we could then add a bunch of haste to items, and we could have more haste than CDR in the systems, right? Because haste wasn't capped and we didn't need all of this like, restrictive stuff. However, when we added haste, that was at the same time we did mythic items. And so we added haste and also significantly powered up the item system at the same time. And so this resulted in kind of an unintended interaction, which was that haste was, the amount of cooldown, like effective cooldown reduction in the system was actually up overall. And this is especially true when we did things like buff items like Spear of Shojin and make items like Spear of Shojin in the first place that provide a lot of haste, that then allowed things like Jace shooting 2 shock blasts through a single gate. That was never intended, right? And a lot of champions' patterns broke down at very high amounts of haste. And so that's one of the reasons why we intentionally tried in this item update to pull a lot of haste back, right? Like make it so the max amount of haste you get is lower than what it was in the in the mythic item version of the system. A lot of people think that it was like a goal, or that it was like, oh, Riot wants to make League Earth mode, and that's why they made haste instead of CDR because it's uncapped. It's like, no, it was made like that so that we didn't have to have these really perverse optimizations in the system where it was like, hey, if you have 30 haste, the next 10 haste is way more valuable, CDR. If you have 30 CDR, going to 40 CDR is incredibly valuable, but then after that, CDR has 0 value, right? There's very, very bizarre optimizations around this, and very few people understand the math behind this. I could give a presentation. In fact, I actually have given a presentation on the math behind it to Riot Design in general. I could talk about this for hours, but just you're going to have to bear with me here if you don't want to look at the math. If you do want to look at the math, go to Wolfram Alpha and just type 1 over x, and then look at the center, like the x-axis, or sorry, the y-axis, and see the asymptote scaling. That's the type of scaling that we're talking about here, asymptotic scaling, where as you approach 0, because the cooldowns are the effective amount of cooldown recovery is effectively infinite, you get more and more value per point. Anyway, I've gotten off on a weird tangent here talking about the scaling. The point is, haste was intended to be a change to make the system more function the way that people expect it to, which is that each point of haste is worth the same as it was before, which is what people expected CDR to do, but it didn't. It actually was worth more. And so the goal was not to increase the overall amount of average, haste that people were getting or average CDR that people were getting. It's just that system was introduced at the same time we substantially powered up the item system, and so it ended up that, yes, it was true that people had a lot more effective haste or effective CDR. But we're trying to address that now by taking that power back and specifically costing haste higher. And so that's why a lot of the changes that you've seen have been made, where no item has 30 haste anymore. The max an item has is Cosmic Drive with 25, which I can't show off because I forgot to put it in my notes that I gave to Ruru, so I'm going to have to fix that later. So sorry. But yeah, Cosmic Drive has 25 haste now instead of 30. And no item has 30 haste. Unless you count, I guess, some, items like, where's the fighter? Unless you count, yes, technically this is giving 35 haste for your non-ultimate spells, just in much the same way that, Malignance is giving you 40 haste for your ultimate, but that's sort of, special case, and it's not giving you to everything, at least. So in most cases, that should be true. Anyway, big change behind the scenes for assassin items is that lethality is now flat. It's just armor penetration. For people who are saying, well, then just call it armor penetration, the reason why we changed it to lethality in the first place, or one of the compelling reasons why we changed it to lethality in the first place, is that newer players, when they're told this item gives you 20 armor penetration, they assume it's good against armor, which is actually the opposite of what's true. It's bad against armor. Armor pen is flat armor pen is explicitly bad against armor in this game. And so lethality is a good way of just kind of getting across the point, which is this is for killing squishies, even though it's really just disguising armor pen. And if your argument then is, well, you should change magic pen to a different name, I agree, we should do that, but not today. Anyway, so flat armor pen scaling is mostly that realistically the scaling on lethality was very, very mild. Theoretically, it was 0.6 to 1, which sounds like a lot. Hey, you're getting almost double the value at max level. But the reality is that by the time you bought your first Dirk, you were already at 0.7 or 0.8 value. And so you're really only increasing the value of your of most of your lethality over the course of the game by 10, 20-ish%. It really wasn't that big of a deal. And so it was my argument when I did the when I was pitching the assassin item space to Phlox, who worked on this and did this actual change, was, hey, I think you should either make the scaling matter or remove it, right? I don't think we should have this really weird, very mild scaling, which doesn't do that much in the game. And so he decided to go on the more straightforward path, which was to just remove the scaling, make it flat. And so assassins now will be better in the early game. It won't be as, it won't be a crazy, oh my God, they're suddenly dealing 20% more damage in the early game, when they buy a Dirk. That's not what's going to happen here. But they will generally do a little more damage, and they'll scale a little bit worse because we can't give them the same amount of stats that we gave them in the previous system, because obviously their stats are better early, right? Again, not a huge difference, but there will be a difference here. And so this is kind of similar to what I was talking about with mages, where it's we generally want mages to be a little bit better against squishies and scale better with gold and a little bit worse against tanks. This is an assassin class rebalancing in a minor way of we want assassins to be a little bit better early on and not scale quite as well as they do currently. And so that's also why we've changed the rules, by the way, to make it so that you cannot stack multiple % penetration items or % shred items. So you can no longer buy Black Cleaver plus Serylda's, for example, because that was a way for assassins to scale really hard at a late game, because they could basically ignore your armor. They could get effectively, once Cleaver was stacked, more than 50% armor penetration % pen, right? And so that made them scale very well in ways that we didn't think were appropriate. So Voltaic Cyclosword, this is something that Phlox wanted to make ever since Kerchase Shard was made into an AD component rather than an AS component. Was, hey, energized as a pattern makes a lot of sense for assassins, especially if you put dashes and stealth stacked energized faster onto an item. And so this is a cool item where it's hey, if you're a Rengar and you dash a lot, you stack energize really fast. This pattern makes a lot of sense. In much the same way that the energized pattern, the Shiv LeBlanc thing, hey, she stacks energize really well. AD assassins do too, but we can make an item that's actually tailored for them with energize, because Shard builds out of an AD component now as of last mid-season. And so this is just a cool experiment in the AD energized space. Profane Hydra is the new lethality Hydra. This is intended to be like a tailored item for champions like Zed and Talon that want to buy like Hydra-like items sometimes, but have been kind of restricted to Rav Hydra before, and then they have a bunch of Vamp that we don't really want to give them. This is a more tailored item for them that we can actually tune them around, and then we don't have to worry about them having like infinite Vamp and being more bruisery. We can actually give them an item in this space that is tailored for them and is more assassin-y, and we can actually make as an assassin item, which is very cool. Hubris is a sweet item. The fantasy of this item is that you buy this item, you have the hubris. You're saying that you're going to get all the kills. You're gonna you're gonna get the statue, and you're gonna look at yourself with immense pride. And so the goal here is for this to kind of substitute for it's I want to be clear here. This is not really supposed to be like AD Sword of the Occult, but it's sort of in that space, right? Where it's like snowballing. If you can keep getting a kill every 60 seconds, you get to keep the AD, right? But if you don't get a kill for 60 seconds, well, AD from Hubris for you, right? Like you just get the base amount on the item. And so, that's sort of what the goal of this item is like, hey, if you're snowballing and you think you're going to keep snowballing, you buy this item. Again, kind of like sort of the occult, but in a much more manageable way where the stacks fall off after 6 seconds. The goal is not necessarily to kill you because that doesn't remove your stacks. The goal is to not die to the assassin, right? So it's like a bit of a twist on the old sort of the occult / like Medjai's paradigm. Opportunity, movement speed item, builds out of Rectrix, which is the new AD MS item. It's kind of like the AD Ether Wisp. Just kind of a nice like role. This is just kind of like a role-playing item. Like it's just like filling in holes for certain champions in the system. Sorry if you could hear that loud noise outside. It's just sort of supposed to be filling in holes in the system, and it sort of gives you an escape. It's kind of like supposed to be very, very light version of like Duskblade, which like helped you escape. This gives you movement speed, but it's like, it's a lot of movement speed, but it's decaying, and it's obviously a lot less powerful than going invisible or going intangible or whatever, right? It's supposed to fill in some space for some of the assassins that didn't have enough items. As mentioned, the Rectrix Brutalizer's back. This is supposed to be the more expensive lethality component, where this item is 1337, and then we're making Dirk cheaper, and Dirk does not have haste, and I think it has more lethality. I don't actually know how much lethality it has. Let's see. Looks like it has the same amount, which I don't even know how much that is. I think it's 10. Anyway, Brutalizer will be more expensive, but it'll build out a pickaxe, so there will actually be reasons to not only buy longswords on assassins. This is to get more build variety for assassins, and also more component cost variety. Because some of these items build out a Brutalizer, some of them build out a Dirk, like for example, Opportunity is Dirk, and Profane Hydra is Brutalizer. So gives us a way of making it so that not every assassin item builds out of Dirk plus Warhammer. And also some more variety in build paths for AD assassins. Cyrilda's is changed to now have armor penetration that scales off of your lethality, so it's very good in full lethality builds, but not so good if it's you have one lethality item. It won't be nearly as good as it was. Also, making it so that this is I believe missing in the patch notes. Let me type this up to Riru again. Sorry if this typing is really loud. Since my mic is right next to my keyboard. Actually, here, let me mute for a second. All right, this Cyrilda's passive now only works if the enemy is below 50%, unless this changed very recently. As far as I'm aware, I believe that this line is incorrect. The point is basically making this more of a restrictive item that's less generically good for your random Yorick builds, less insane for your fighter Aatrox builds, where you then use this to just set up all of your Qs because the slow always works, and less generically powerful and more tailored towards actual assassin play and actual assassin builds. So we'll see how this works out. I am not as knowledgeable about this space, so I can't necessarily say. This is a little bit cheaper, a little bit less AD. Yumu's going back to being a cheaper item that's there for roaming and getting around the map. No spectral shard mechanic from the mythic version, which was obviously weird. Axiom Arc, pretty similar, but yeah, it's just, you know, lethality scaling. And yeah, Umbral Glaive, very similar, a little bit more expensive, a little bit more lethality. So a little bit harder to access this if you're a support. This is something we're doing that's very intentional of like, hey, you know, you can still buy this and it can still be powerful as a support, but you don't get it as early and you pay a little bit more of a cost to actually invest into this as a support. And Serpent Fang, this is an item we tried a bunch of changes to, but didn't really get anywhere. I suspect we'll probably want to change this item at some point in the future, but not this time. We tried stuff, it didn't really work out. We'll try something. Marksman items. Some people were asking why no more changes, or why not more changes to marksman items. The main reason is basically compound. Number one is we just changed the marksman items a lot in the mid-season, like the previous mid-season update, like mid-season 13. And we know that AD carry players generally don't like it when we change their items a lot over the course of a short period of time. This is feedback we've gotten many times before when we've like back-to-back changed AD carry items significantly in subsequent updates, like when we did preseason, I think it was preseason 9, I don't remember, but like that's basically after the 8.11 patch. And then we changed AD carry items a bunch after that. AD carries players actually complained a lot about it. And we know this from like feedback surveys and stuff. I'm not like looking at Reddit and looking and complaining, but like actually our actual feedback surveys of like, hey, are you happy with your items or whatever? You know, asking questions like that. And so less change here than we could have done because we wanted to rein things in, and also because we generally believe the 80 carry items were in an okay spot. Like for the most part, we're not unhappy with these. New item here, Terminus. I suspect this level scaling probably needs to be harsher. Probably is too much armor and MR early, but we'll see. Yeah, Terminus, we're trying something new in the on-hit space. Over time, we've generally identified that like on-hit builds have to be different from crit in some way for them to be interesting. And so one of the things we've identified that could be different is utility, right? Or, you know, defenses, right? Wit's End is one way this is true. And so we've changed Wit's End to be less of a generically powerful item. And so we have a little bit of space for something like a Terminus, which can fill in some space in that it can, do some cool stuff and also occupy the percent armor and MPen space for on-hit users so that Rageblade doesn't have to do everything, right? Part of the reason to make this item is because previously Rageblade was like carrying so many different things. It was carrying the on-hit capstone and the percent pen and also being a core on-hit item, like providing an on-hit by itself for all on-hit users, which is like, it's just too many things for the item to do at once is very hard for us to make it make sense in that space. And so splitting that, some of that out into Terminus and also putting some utility on that is a way for us to like make the on-hit system more interesting. And also less, direct competitor to crit, because of course, again, if on-hit is just damage, it's not very interesting, right? It's like, okay, well, here's damage and here's damage, right? It's like, if on-hit at least is, here's damage, it's a little bit less damage, but you get more utility, whether it's selfish defenses or whatever, that's at least an interesting way of differentiating them. So that the builds can be clearly different. Rageblade, mostly this is just removing the mythic nonsense from the item, the crit conversion is gone. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. I actually am only using this Opera browser because it has a really easy, like it has an innate dark mode thing for the patch notes, and I figured people would appreciate that. Normally I use Firefox, so I haven't used Opera very much recently. But yeah, anyway, so I don't really know what's going on with the translation thing, but I got rid of it. So, Infinity Edge, mostly just demythicking these items. Like in the 80 carry item system, it's interesting because the mythics actually weren't really the full mythics. Like I kept saying earlier, like the Noon Quiver items were basically the like sharing like half-ish of the burden of being mythics. They didn't have the mythic passives, but they were more powerful than regular items. And so that's why we have to change them to some degree. So not really much interesting to talk about here in the 80 carry system in general, though. It's like, yeah, we nerfed these items because they were mythics or because they were pseudo-mythics. GA, obviously there's no stopwatch anymore, so yeah, we just gave it, because it has a much worse build path, we gave it a little bit more armor and a little bit more AD. Also, this was a change that I wanted to make, which is it gives you 100% mana instead of 30%. I always thought this was really weird. Like you're playing Jace or whatever, you build a GA, and you could actually like have near full mana respawn or like get your GA popped and then actually have way less mana. I always thought that was really weird. So I recommended changing it to 100% max mana, and that was done. So very nice. Minor changes here for Shield Bow, changes to Kraken Slayer. not too much that's interesting here. Lord Dom's, I don't think is. Oh yeah, it's up to 15%, and it's at caps at 2,000 now. Honestly, I didn't really keep up with these changes that much, but yeah, PD is more movement speed baseline, but you don't get movement speed from the actual like the stacking effect anymore. So just better, when you're not hitting stuff. A little bit worse in terms of movement speed when you are, but it also obviously gives you more attack speed per stack, and can theoretically be maximum at the same. Not really too much to say about this. I don't really have too much to say about this stuff other than that. Yeah, there's minor changes that we're making around here to adjust for the lack of mythic systems. So let's talk about the support items. Wow, this has been a lot of stuff I'm recording here. Support items. So we had a bunch of goals around the support item originally around like, hey, we want people to feel better when they're playing support, and we want supports to have, more skill tests and more ways to interact with the item system and all sorts of stuff, right? Like, there's, again, if you want to read the items dev blog post, you can read more about that stuff. But one of the big goals that isn't really discussed much around this is that we know that buying items later in the game is a lot more interesting and compelling than buying them at level 1. At level 1, you're just going to pick whatever's good on your champion, and maybe you might counter your lane opponent a little bit, right? Like, you might, in the support item space, you might choose between like the Targans and the Spell Thieves if you're like Rakan or something, right, for example. But very few champions have access to both spaces. And so you mostly just buy a really boring support item that eventually gives you a Sightstone, right? And so with this update, we're looking to spice that up where, sure, everyone buys the same item at level 1, the World Atlas, but you eventually turn it into something that's different based on your champion. And some champions might actually have different, diverse options in this structure, right? You can upgrade into one of 5 different items, which are Celestial Opposition, Solstice Slay, Blood Song, Dreammaker, and Zazzax. Realm Spike. I'm just going to call it Realm Spike. I don't like Zazzax. But yeah, in general, you have this kind of selfish defensive option. You have the sort of slowing, or you have this sort of like, hey, the CC combo option that is good for team fighting. You have the more offensive Sheen option, right? This is really cool for some champions that have high synergy with Sheen, since you get the damage amp here. You get the Dreammaker, which is pretty clearly the Enchanter option if you don't need the like selfish defenses from like selfish Celestial Opposition or whatever. This is like obviously the default Enchanter option because of course you just get generic Enchanter stuff. And then the generic damage option, which is very similar to like a Luden's type of proc. Overall, some kind of generic items, right? Opposition, Realm Spike are both very generic, and even Solstice Slay is really pretty generic too, to be honest. But yeah, some of these should be different in different games, and some champions are going to have higher synergy with others, or sorry, some with others. And so we know that making that decision later in the game is interesting, and also we know that supports make fewer choices in the item system that are interesting than other roles, right? Because they just get less gold. And so particularly after they buy their first item, when they're on their support quest and they're getting lots of gold, they buy less items later in the game. And so we know for a fact that supports just on average, purchase fewer items. And so the item system is actually mastering the item system is less relevant for them. And so having this special support item system that comes in later lets us do 2 things. Number one, lets us give back some of that choice in the item system, and like mastery of the item system being rewarding for supports. That's actually compelling. Like, this is a skill test, like a real skill test that we can give supports that's actually interesting in the item system, which is hard to give them otherwise because they get less gold, so they just can't buy as many items. That's number one. And then number 2 is that this is something that we can give that's unique to supports that other roles do not get, right? And so it gives you a compelling reason like, hey, supports get less gold. Why would you play a champion in support, right? In all the other roles, this is obvious, right? Junglers do get a little less gold on average, right? And they get a little bit lower level, right? But it's still obvious why you'd play Kayn in the jungle rather than in lane, right? But it might not be immediately obvious why you would play Brand as a support rather than mid lane, or Xerath, or any champion, or Pantheon, or whatever, right? And so giving support something unique to attach to their role, to sort of exchange like, hey, you do get less gold and less experience than everyone else in the game, but at least you get this cool special thing besides a vision, right? Because previously what we did was give them vision, and yeah, for some people, vision is a cool, compelling output, but it's not even for most support players. And so we're not going to take away that vision. They still get the vision effect, but we also want to give them something cool and special that actually affects combat. And so that's why all of these are combat effects and not like out of combat effects that don't affect you in the actual direct combat scenarios. And so giving them a cool combat effect is hopefully a reason why people can understand, hey, I want to play this champion in support because I want Celestial Opposition, or I want Slay, or I want Bloodsong, or whatever. Moving on here to the Enchanter items. Glowing Mode is a new component. I'm pretty sure that I pitched this in Wild Rift like 2 years ago, and that I somehow inceptioned Soul Crushed, who also came back to work on League from Wild Rift with me, into thinking that this was a good idea. I still think it's a good idea, but I'm pretty sure I pitched this myself, and then Soul pitched it as if it was his idea, which was weird. So yeah, anyway, beside the point. This is just a cool haste component. It makes it so that haste doesn't just come from nowhere in every item. It's not really supposed to be something that you like buy and sit on and are excited about, but it at least makes it clearer where haste is coming from in items, and makes it so that some bases will be better for champions that are buying haste items in the future, that they can fit an extra 250 gold. In general, I actually quite like having some of these, like having like one or maybe two cheaper components that are actually good and build into real items. Stuff like Fairy Charm doesn't really count because very few champions actually buy items that build out a Fairy Charm. So yeah, hopefully this will be compelling. I don't think it'll be a huge change, but it's very nice for trackability in the shop of like, where did this haste come from? Dawn Core is a new item we're making, which is fairly different from other enchanter items in that it just gives you heal and shield power and AP, right? And that's its primary output. One of the things you might notice if you look at all the enchanter items is they do two things. They do one of two things, right? One is they cast their own spell, right? This is like a Redemption or like a Mikhail's. The other thing that they do is they add a new effect to your spells, right? This is like Ardent Censer. This is like Staff of Flowing Waters, etc., right? Those are really the only two kinds of enchanter items we have in the system. We don't have any enchanter items in the system that just say your kit is just better, right? The things that your kit does are better. We have those items in every other system, right? We have Death Cap, we have we have Eclipse, right? Like sure, there are items that have mild other effects, but there's just items that are just giving you a lot of stats that enhance your actual kit in basically every other system. And so it makes sense for enchanters to have at least one of these items that's just like, hey, this item just makes your kit better at doing what it does. And you don't have to worry about like, are you the best at applying Ardent Sensors? Like, well, if you're good at healing and shielding, it doesn't matter who you are applying them to. This just makes them better, right? Or if you have good AP ratios or whatever, right? Like that's the point of Dawn Core, is that this item offers a pure kit enhancement in a way that we don't currently offer it in the enchanter system. It's also kind of a capstone, which is interesting. I'm not sure how that part is going to work out, but I really like the part where it's just, hey, this offers you raw stats. But the capstone effect is like, obviously supports often don't get to full build. And so we'll see how that part works out. But the Summoner Spell Haste is obviously quite attractive generally and all that. Here is just like mythic, post-mythic adjustments. Changing this back because we don't have the movement speed on Shurelya's anymore. We can put the movement speed back on Staff of Flowing Waters, or Staff of Flowing Water, which originally was taken away from it because we put it on Shurelya's. Ardent Sensor, giving a little bit more AS and magic damage. So I changed Omnivamp. We can talk about starting items now. I changed Omnivamp, therefore Doran's Blade cannot have Omnivamp because it would have been terrible. So Omnivamp is 20% effect on minions and monsters, so that would have been a really big nerf to Doran's Blade. So change this back to Lifesteal. Doran's Blade did a little bit of a simplification pass on this. I didn't really think we were getting any value out of this like weird conditional, like, hey, if you've hit someone, like get rewarded for harassing. And so I just changed it to the middle value if for all the time. So that when you're getting blasted in lane, you don't get less value from your Doran's Ring, which I always thought was weird. It's like, it's like very invisible, but if you were losing lane really hard, you actually were often just getting punished by your own Doran's Ring if you couldn't strike back. So I personally just prefer this version. Runes. So, perfect timing. I replaced Stopwatch with Seeker's Arm Guard, which meant that I really wanted to replace the rune. I actually did consider a version of the system, by the way, where I left the rune alone, and it was just that you couldn't purchase Stopwatch, because I actually thought the rune was like moderately acceptable, where you had to take a cost at level 1. Like, this meant you didn't take another rune, right? Whereas the biggest problem with Stopwatch truly was the late game purchases, right? Where hey, it's a late game team fight that's really important. There are 4 extra Zonia, stasis effects in this team fight because the Jarvan bought it, the Lee Sin on the enemy team bought it, the top lane, Aurelia bought it, the Renekton bought one, right? It's like every important fight had a ton of stopwatches, and I really disliked that, like especially the team fights that had tons and tons and tons of stopwatch activations. But I felt like the versions of stopwatch where you had it from level 1 actually weren't. The rune version was not like a huge problem. But it also made sense to remove it because it's just like, yeah, we just generally feel like there's too many stopwatch actives happening in the game. And so it made sense to remove it. So I replaced it with this triple tonic. And what this thing does is basically just gives you a bunch of random garbage. I tried a lot of different runes in this space. I tried a rune that interacted with plants. That was okay. I think there's something there. Like I experimented initially in the rune space of like, what does the rune, what do we not have runes that currently, or what do we have, or what do we not have runes that currently do? I don't know if that makes sense, but basically, hey, what are unexplored spaces in the rune area? Like what are things that runes don't currently interact with? First thing I did was plants, but it was pretty clear within like a week of working on a plant version of it that I just didn't have enough time to make a good plant version. I think there's something there that could eventually work. And so maybe in the future we might do something like that, which interacts with plants in a direct way. The version I had was like when you kill a plant or when an ally kills a plant near you, you get some effect. Yeah, that version I think is just really hard to make work because it has some really perverse incentives around the plants. Like you just walk around hitting plants randomly, and so it would have needed like a cooldown, it would have needed VFX for that, and all sorts of other stuff, and like complicated rules I needed to figure out. So then I tried experimenting in the experience space because we don't have runes that directly interact with experience. And that was just deemed to be really dangerous, which I agree with. Like anything that messes with experience is very, very, very dangerous. That's another space where it's like, I think if I had more time, I could have done something there. But experience led me down a path of like, hey, what about Elixir of Skill? We removed Elixir of Skill, which is really cool because it gives you a skill point with Kleptomancy. But that's something that's like way worse than experience, right? A level gives you like potentially thousands of gold worth of stats. But a skill point's way worse than a level because the level gives you a skill point and the skill point doesn't give you any stats. So I originally made this rune. I don't even remember what it was called, the version. I think it was just called Skill Point or something. And it just said at level 9, get an Elixir of Skill. And people liked it, but it was terrible. Like it was legitimately awful. And so what I did was I added 2 more elixirs that we can tune to this because the skill elixir isn't really tunable. And we don't really want to give an elixir of skill before level 9 because we don't want to mess with like your first max necessarily. That's like really, really a lot of power for a minor rune. And so the level 9 elixir of skill makes a lot of sense. And so I added 2 new elixirs to it to give some extra power earlier in the game that actually does something, outside, like, and have some numbers outside of elixir of skill. And so we ended up with this triple tonic, which I'm really happy with. I think it's just a super fun rune. I highly recommend checking it out. Hopefully people really like triple tonic. Tower adjustments. This is something that I know Phlox has wanted to do for a long time. But primarily we made this adjustment because we're adding the Grub bonus to the game and also felt like towers were just a little on the squishy side on live. And so we're making towers a little bit tankier overall. Just a bit more health, 400 on inners, 200 on inhibitors, and 300 on the Nexus towers. And some changes to the rules. People, unless you're doing some like really degenerate stuff, you don't really have to worry about this change at all. Don't worry about it. It's just disregard it unless you're a degenerate. And I think that's pretty much it. Dynamic music. This is pretty cool. You check this out. I'm not going to talk too much about it because I don't know too much about it. Oh, the in-game quests. I can still talk about in-game quests. So these are mostly pretty mild. Like you don't get anything too crazy. You get like 4 lethality or 3% magic pen or whatever. You get some attack speed or whatever, right? Like you don't get too much out of these, but they're very cool. And hopefully these quests like actually trigger sometimes and people can get some, have some fun with them. Because I actually think these quests are very, very cool when they can trigger. And if these are things that people really like, maybe in the future we might add more of these. We'll see. I think that's pretty much it for the patch notes. I don't know how long this is. Hopefully, I don't know how long this video is going to be. It's definitely going to be really low quality. Oh, the quality of life changes. So we've actually been working on these. There's going to be more in the next patch too in 14.2, but we've been working on some of these where, stuff that's just like hey, this would be nice if we did this. And then, some nice bug fixes. Yeah. But some good stuff. And yeah, this is a great patch. Hopefully, this was good. Honestly, I feel like the later parts of this video were pretty good. I feel like the early parts I was definitely struggling. It's been a long time since I've done this, like, just talk to... Well, I guess in this case, it's really just like talking to myself and then recording it. But yeah, so if people have more questions or things they want me to talk about this season, or things they want to hear about development story-wise, or I don't know, if you have thoughts, questions, comments, let me know. You can put them on this video or message me on Twitter. My DMs, I believe, are open on Twitter. I'm pretty sure I haven't closed them or anything. But yeah, if you have thoughts, thanks for watching. But yeah, if you have thoughts, let me know. Thanks for watching, and yeah, I guess I'll go stitch these clips together. Oh yeah, also apologies for all the weirdness. I'm probably not going to cut out like the weird knocking on my door and stuff unless it's really bad. I'll go check on that now, I guess. But yeah, thanks for watching, and yeah, if you want to hear more or if you want to hear more from me, then let me know. Or if you're just say, hey, you're tired of hearing me ramble, don't make any more videos, that's also fine. It's totally reasonable. I can totally understand that perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching, and maybe see you in the future.